Chapter 13-19. In the sky above the Willow Sea, Lu Xiaoyu read through all the jade slips carefully, a smile appearing on his face. In fact, even though there were many jade slips, most of them were meaningless and belonged to the category of small family greetings. But seeing these on the eve of great change still made him feel very warm. There was a kind of sense of fullness, letting him know what he was fighting for. There was a slug. This guy finally caught the last bus. With his arrogant personality, he wouldn't leave a letter unless he became a monarch. He was very arrogant. There was a cleft lip. It was mainly to express his apology for not being here last time, and to invite him for a drink. In fact, he just wanted to find out something. This guy's nose was very sharp. Being in a big sect like Yuanshe, he definitely had a premonition but was not sure. There were a few old seniors of the Shou Xian sword vein. Besides being concerned, they asked him if there was a possibility of cooperation. Similarly, there was a letter from Tang Jinjuan of the sword vein of Tiger Hill. It also had the same intention. He had hesitated about these friends of the sword vein before, but in the end, he decided not to drag them down with him. The battles in the future would be very cruel. It was not impossible for a sect to be wiped out in one battle. Their foundation was limited and they couldn't withstand it. When it came to risking their lives, how could he drive them up? Only the scattered swordsmen under him didn't need to consider the issue of inheritance. They could come and go as they pleased. They were the best companions. Moreover, they had been trained by him for hundreds or even hundreds of years. Their strength was already different. How could he guide the 8 Zhou Xian sword veins? Perfected cultivator Xiao Jia told him to go back and die. Because when he left, he unconsciously said goodbye, which was a bit abrupt. More importantly, how could the person who said goodbye just lie at the window and not go in? Well, there was a misunderstanding. Xia Bingji also left a letter. It was as plain as usual, but there was a hint of worry in it about his ability to torment. Well, I wonder how this girl's pregnancy is going? I kind of want to. And so on. This kind of information came from Zhou Xian's concern. He suddenly realized that other than these sword vein brothers, he was also quite popular. At the very least, he could entrust them to him. The most important jade slip came from Yu Hu. He had discovered some very interesting things in the pirate group. Even with his knowledge, he was still unable to see through them. However, right now, in Lu Xiaoyi's eyes, it was very memorable. After gathering all the information, he felt that his thoughts had become much clearer. Unfortunately, there was no news from the Qing Xian that he valued the most. It had been more than 200 years. Would this guy really run all the way back to the 5th ring? Hopefully, he would not be fed to the void beasts in the universe. Everyone was playing their own role, but some were clowns, some were scholars, and some were bandits. Then, who was the real protagonist? The one that could change the course of events? 100 years had passed, and Lu Xiaoyi's mind was becoming clearer and clearer. The only thing he didn't understand was that Heaven's Choice was making such a big move. They were betting on the destiny of the entire continent. What confidence did they have? Actually, it wasn't just Heaven's Choice. There was also a Buddhist sect that seemed to be betting on their future destiny. On what basis did they think that they would definitely succeed? He was very clear that these people were not swordsmen. This was also not a simple battle between individuals. They could do it if they had some degree of confidence. What was it that he had overlooked? Unfortunately, his realm was destined that he couldn't see that far. Banju and the others had finally returned. Not only them, but there were also more than 10 Essence Soul Perfected Lords from Blood River, Soul Cultivator, and Martial Saint Training Hall. Obviously, Banju wasn't able to convince them. They wanted to see who this person who had been standing behind the sword vein was. Both sides didn't exchange any pleasantries and went straight to the point. Because everyone knew that now wasn't the time to bicker. 10,000 feet above the Willow Sea, Lu Xiaoyi was facing 11 Essence Soul Perfected Lords. To be honest, he really didn't know how to convince them. They were humans. They weren't as easy to trick as primordial beasts. Blood River Alliance's true Lord Jiao Shui was very direct and a little impolite. In his opinion, his current attitude was already giving face to this swordsman who had shocked the continent with his battle at Echo Valley. However, he was only a Yin master now. In the cultivation world, strength spoke louder than words. Fellow Taoist Dan, we're indeed here for the Alliance. However, we're not here to join anyone. Who do you serve as your master? I'll be honest. With the current strength of your sword vein, you're still not worthy. Aggressive, but no one stopped him. Clearly, they had come to a tacit understanding before coming. Lu Xiao sneered. My messenger has already made it very clear. If you want to form an alliance with my sword vein, you can only serve us as your master. This is the prerequisite. Speaking of strength, do you not see it clearly enough? Whether it's individually or as a team, sword vein is above all of you. There's no need to argue about this. We'll know after a battle. That's why I don't understand. You've come all the way here. You can't do this or that. What are you doing here? Jiao Shui narrowed his eyes, his gaze sharp. You're very confident? But you have to let us see the source of your confidence. Lu Xiao spread out his hands. There are many things that can't be seen before you lay your cards on the table. You know it very well. There's no point in arguing like this. It's just wasting everyone's time. Why don't I make a suggestion? Let's first settle the things that can be settled between us. For example, the problem of strength. Before Jiao Shui could answer, a strong man stood up. Good suggestion. My martial saint training hall agrees with this method. We're all smart people. Without mentioning anything else, the so-called alliance is naturally decided by the strength of the fist. This is the rule of the cultivation world. I'm Long Jian. I'm willing to compete with fellow Taoists. Jiao Shui was somewhat dissatisfied, but there was nothing he could do. After all, he was from the Blood River sect and could not control the martial saint training hall. The three sects were originally on equal footing. There was no need to talk about who could dominate who. As for this alliance, they were actually here to test the waters. They were here to see if it matched the faint rumors in their hearts. Comparing skills was not important, but it had to be said that it was a good way to have a peaceful atmosphere in the future negotiations. Long Jian, on the other hand, had a fine point. Fighting until the sky turns dark is not suitable for the current situation. How about this, you and I, 3 fists against 3 swords? No one can dodge. What do you think? Lu Xiao laughed involuntarily. Sure enough, it was the iron law of the cultivation world. No one with thick eyebrows and big eyes was stupid. They were all people with deep thoughts. They had obviously seen his battle in Echo Valley. They were afraid that if they used their swords and battle tactics, they would not have the confidence to win. Therefore, they chose this kind of traditional idiotic fighting style. Their goal was nothing more than to play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. It would make the swordsman's most effective escape technique useless. He had no intention of arguing. Time was precious. It was not the time to bicker. Besides, with his unique long-range heavy sword in the sword vein, even the Crow ancestor had to retreat. How could he be afraid of this martial barbarian? Chapter 13:20. Everyone spread out and circled around, leaving enough space for the two of them. Lu Xiao did not hold back. This was not the time to be gentle and polite. Of course, he would be as domineering as possible. Fellow Taoist Long, make your move. You're a guest. I'm afraid that if I draw my sword, you won't have a chance anymore. Long Jian was a little annoyed, but under his thick eyebrows and big eyes, there was a deep heart. This time, why did they not go alone to find Blood River or a group of soul cultivators? Why did they choose swordsmen? There was a deep consideration behind this. In the cultivation world, if several forces were to form an alliance, there would be a lot of rules. The difference in status and strength between each other were all in their hearts. No matter what, they would not need to rely on their fists to compete. This was especially true for powerful cultivators. They were not like ruffians in the countryside fighting for benefits. But this time, they came to verify their thoughts. If this group of swordsmen was indeed under the command of that distant sword giant, then they would be willing to help. Not only was it because of their own situation for thousands of years, but it was also to conform to the general trend of the universe. Wherever the mainstream of Heaven's choice stood, they would stand on the other side. But if these swordsmen were just ordinary stragglers of Heaven's choice sword vein and did not have the approval of that sword giant, then all of this would be meaningless. Although they would still form an alliance, it would probably be a small fight. Everyone would gather together and go to the main world to seek a place to settle down. They could see very clearly that for so many years, the mainstream of Heaven's choice had been tolerating them. That was because they did not want to risk the reputation of bullying the weak, causing thousands of small and medium-sized nations to form an alliance. Even if they did not resist, they would show an uncooperative attitude. This was also something that the major forces did not want to see. But could this balance still be maintained after the chaos began? It was very difficult. When the mainstream orthodoxy of Heaven's choice shed all pretense of cordiality and began to stir up the storm, they would definitely not be as soft as before. There was a high probability that they would use these disobedient forces as an example to others. So they had to leave. There was only this one continent in the negative space. There was no place to stay. Other than the main world, where else could they go? The mainstream orthodoxy of Heaven's choice gave each of them a floating raft. The meaning was very clear. Leave on your own and we won't make things difficult for you. If you continue to stay here as a thorn in my side, I'll deal with you sooner or later. This was the way of conversation that only belonged to the cultivation world. Nothing was said. You were given a raft to figure it out by yourself. Therefore, to them, the crux of the matter was which orthodoxy this person came from. Is it Xiao Yaoyu from Zhou Xian? Or some other unrelated sword vein in the main world? Or perhaps that giant of the sword Dao? This kind of matter was not something that could be solved with just a few words. If he really said that he came from that place, how could he prove it? Even if they could prove it, according to their secret investigation, this person had been in Zhou Xian for nearly 600 years. When he came, he was only a Jin Dan. How could he have such a high position in the sword giant? If there was no promise from a giant, then everything would be in vain. Wouldn't that be foolish? Therefore, the first step was to prove this person's strength through fighting. It was said that every core disciple of the swordsman from that giant of the sword Dao had the ability to surpass realms to kill. The 11 of them came here to test if this was true. He was the first to represent the martial Saint Dao Hall. He also restrained the unjust feeling in his heart. They were all true monarchs. Why should they fight over personal feelings? Lowering their waist slightly, the martial Saint Dao Hall still more or less retained a trace of mortal martial arts. This was also the reason why they were not liked by the mainstream of cultivation. A punch, shattering the void. Just this kind of ability was the manifestation of a very high degree of control over the Dao realm of strength. The martial Saint Dao Hall was also said to be part of the body vein in the cultivation world. However, they were resolute ancient martial artists. They did not rely on their bloodline, did not practice divine arts, did not hide their dharma. They purely relied on martial arts to advance, pursuing the ultimate application of strength. They also disdained other Dao realms. They were very biased, but to be able to persevere, they were worthy of respect. Lu Xiaoyi was not careless. When the opponent punched, his flying sword also shot out. He did not use the sword light to split, because it was a sword against a fist. How to deal with a Dao realm of strength? This was a problem that every high-level cultivator would face. It was not unreasonable to say that a single force could defeat 100 techniques. In fact, if you were proficient in any Dao realm, you could say that the 5 elements could defeat 100 techniques, Yin and Yang could defeat 100 techniques, Karma could defeat 100 techniques, etc. However, strength was something that all mortals possessed. Using strength to fight strength, Lu Xiaoyi did not have that big of a headache. Although this kind of method was the most shocking. He, a Yin Soul True Monarch, compared to an Essence Soul True Monarch who was proficient in the only Dao realm, his brain must be rusty. Regarding this, he already had a plan. Since it was Tao Realm strength, then he could only use Tao Realm strength to fight back. In terms of strength, fate was useless, merit was useless, the 5 elements were useless. However, he still had other options. Once the flying sword flew out, it changed impermanence and created a slight disturbance in the opponent's Tao realm of strength. It was not enough to change the direction of the force field, nor was it enough to reduce the power of the force field. The intention of impermanence was very simple. It was to cause a slight flaw in the opponent's powerful force field, and then, Tao realm of Taishu. If he used Taishu directly, his Taishu Tao realm would not be able to match the opponent's strength. Therefore, he had to first use impermanence to disturb the opponent, then use Taishu Tao realm. Finally, Tao realm slaughter. Under Lu Xiaoyi's indifferent gaze, the flying sword hovered 3 feet away from the opponent. However, even an essence soul true monarch like Long Jian could feel the killing intent from the unseen world. He might still be able to throw a second punch to deflect the flying sword, but in terms of skill, he had already lost. Because once he defended, how could a sword cultivator's attack be so swift and fierce, give him a chance to slow down? His opponent stood there motionless, and had not even used his most proficient sword manipulation. "I've lost! Your sword technique is unparalleled!" Long Jian admitted defeat on Dafa's side was not that shameful. He had proven his opponent's strength, but it seemed like he had not proven anything? What was that sword expert's battle symbol? No one seemed to know much about it. The moment Long Jian admitted defeat, the remaining soul cultivator Go Yuan stood out. "I'll take 3 hits from you. If you can't hurt me, you lose!" This was also a smart move. Soul cultivators were good at mental attacks. When they fought with others, they mostly attacked mentally. It was impossible for an illusory soul's shadow to randomly attack with a knife. However, Go Yuan observed from the side and realized that the swordsman's mental strength was abnormally strong. If they really fought, his advantage in mental attacks was limited, and he could not form an effective attack. Therefore, he might as well not attack and let the opponent attack. This was also a major characteristic of soul bodies. They did not care about physical attacks like flying swords, and they did not have any internal organs for you to stab. Soul cultivators were afraid of lightning. However, from what he knew, this person did not display any lightning abilities in Echo Valley. That battle was only 100 years ago, and it was impossible for him to have comprehended a new Tao realm. Therefore, he had nothing to fear. Chapter 13:21. Lu Xiaoyi nodded with a smile. Soul body? He had plenty of ways to deal with it. He had a deep understanding of soul bodies, starting from Yu Hu's strange amber. In fact, every soul body had something like this, a place where the soul's thoughts were stored. This was the unity of the real and the illusory. A normal human body also had places that were illusory. For example, the Naiwan Palace and the Sea of Consciousness were the most important places for cultivators. Similarly, a soul body would also have a real place, which was also its most important place. It was just that because it was heavily guarded and hidden well, no one could find it. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi couldn't see through it either. Being able to see through a soul's origin with a single glance was an ability that only cultivators at the half-immortal realm and above could possess. However, Yu Hu had once told him about some secrets regarding soul bodies, such as, the flying sword had no Tao realm, nor did it have any speed or power. It just flew over lightly, causing Go Yuan, who was on high alert, to feel a little nervous. It wasn't right for a primordial soul true monarch to be nervous in front of a Yin master. However, he had no choice. This swordsman was really too strange. Especially when he couldn't figure out something like this, he couldn't help but feel worried. He was worried that he would fall into his opponent's trap. When the flying sword neared his soul body, it suddenly lit up. Go Yuan's heart jumped. This was the sign of the lightning energy that he had been guarding against so much. This swordsman actually knew about lightning? The hardest step for a cultivator to reach the Tao realm was the first step. If the Tao realm was divided into 10 parts, the hardest step would be to go from 0 to 1. Therefore, when the flying sword flashed with lightning, Go Yuan subconsciously reacted and moved the real place in his soul body to a safer place. To soul cultivators, the location of the real place was different for different opponents. Especially for physical swords and lightning energy, which were two completely different types of attacks, the location of the real place was very particular. Before Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword reached his body, he retracted it. He only looked at a certain place in Go Yuan's soul body and smiled without saying anything. Only then did Go Yuan understand. He had been extremely careful, but he had still fallen into the swordsman's trap. It was obvious that the swordsman knew how to use lightning, but he wasn't proficient in it. The reason why he made that gesture in front of him was to provoke him into reacting. By reacting, he had also exposed his position. If the swordsman wanted to kill him, all he needed to do was to point at him. What this swordsman truly understood was whether a soul was real or fake. There was nothing to be shameless about. Go Yuan let out a long sigh. Fellow Taoist's ability is not something that I can compare to. I am inferior. He retreated to the side and remained silent. Ho Shui's face stiffened. Originally, this was just a test, but he hadn't expected his side to be so weak. Now, his original goal was no longer important. The most important thing was how to protect everyone's face. How to protect the face of 11 primordial soul cultivators in front of a single Yin master. I have a river of blood. As long as fellow Taoist Dan can find me, you win. After saying that, he spread out the river of blood. It was as if a beautiful red cloud floated above the Willow Sea. Under the light of the setting sun, the entire Willow Sea turned red. The river of blood was the symbol of a blood river cultivator. In this aspect, it was like the flying sword to the swordsman. The key to the battle against the blood river sect was how to find him. Otherwise, they wouldn't even have the chance to attack. In this aspect, Ho Shui was the fairest among the three of them. Of course, he played a little trick. If a person was in the river of blood, if the Ho Shui took the initiative to attack, then the chances of him being exposed would greatly increase. But if he decided to hide, then every drop of blood in the river of blood could be his hiding place, and the difficulty would increase by several levels. In a real life and death battle, Ho Shui would definitely make a move. Therefore, he still needed to maintain a balance between attacking and hiding. But now, he had expanded his advantage to infinity. In fact, the three of them didn't realize that when they proposed this method of battle, they had already lost. Because they didn't have confidence. Otherwise, was this a condition that the primordial spirit proposed? Under the prestige of that sword master, how many cultivators could straighten their backs? The higher the realm, the more they understood the horror. Lu Xiaoyi stepped in. He was no stranger to the river of blood. The first time he came into contact with it was the old Foundation establishment stage cultivator Yapu in Fish Leap. Then, it was his friend Ho Shui in the land of exile. Finally, it was the blood river Yang God that he saw in the sword Dao tablet that was killed by the Crow ancestor. When he was in Foundation establishment, he came up with the method himself. When he was in Jindan, he often discussed with Ho Shui. The Crow ancestor's killing technique showed him a new direction. However, he couldn't learn the Crow ancestor's method because the Crow ancestor's judgment of the river of blood was another fortuitous encounter. He could only use his own method. This was also the principle he adhered to. In fact, when he was in Foundation establishment, the method he used to deal with Yapu was very imaginative. At that time, he used the fluctuation of spiritual vigor produced by the collision of two flying swords to find the whereabouts of the other person. Of course, he was different now. His flying swords had already broken through the 1,000,000 level and were steadily advancing towards 2,000,000. He was no longer limited by a few flying swords. The fluctuation of spiritual vigor had long been replaced by the perception of the Tao realm. The bird gun had been replaced by a cannon. Once the sword light came out, he didn't hide it. The sword river formed by 1 or 2 million sword lights completely overlapped with the river of blood. Then, the million sword lights began to transform into the Tao realm. 5 elements: higher void, massacre, impermanence. With the transformation of his Tao realm, the blood droplets around each sword light had no choice but to respond. Passively, instinctively responding, including the drop of blood that Ho Shui was hiding. In fact, his body could freely switch between the countless drops of blood as long as there was a safe passage. Within the river of blood, there was blood everywhere and Tao everywhere. It should have been a foolproof movement, but because the 1 or 2 million sword lights were tightly stuck to him, he lost the freedom to switch freely. Sometimes, the stupidest method was also the most effective. Ho Shui had no choice but to completely relax himself. He only treated himself as a small drop of blood and didn't dare to take the initiative to react. He was afraid that the natural reaction of the countless drops of blood would reveal his difference. He was confident. Although the swordsman's Tao realm control was marvelous, these 4 Tao realm cultivators had nothing to do with the post-celestial Tao of the Blood River. They were the kind of people who minded their own business. Just as he was feeling content, the river of blood suddenly retracted. The swordsman stared at his hiding place. "Fellow Taoist Ho Shui, let's not hide anymore, shall we?" Ho Shui was shocked. Of course, he knew that the swordsman wasn't speaking empty words. His gaze was fixed on the drop of blood he was hiding in. There was no mistake. How did he get exposed? This was what he was most anxious to know. However, this was the secret of the swordsman's sword technique. How could he ask? Lu Xiaoyi's face was calm and collected. In fact, all the Tao realm cultivators were fake. The river of blood was just for show. The one that was truly effective was the blood river's nemesis, the Tao of merit. This was the advantage of knowing more Tao. You could always find a way to counter it. Chapter 13:22. When they gathered together, the nature of the conversation had quietly changed. Lu Xiaoyi firmly grasped the right to speak. "Let's not waste any more words. The only reason you came here, to the Willow Sea, is because of the existence of this tablet. If your blood nation's Blood River tablet also has such a legend, then needless to say, my sword vein will also obediently fly over to seek cooperation. So, this is something that everyone is well aware of. What's the point of arguing? There's a sword Tao tablet here. You want to follow the sword Tao tablet, and not us, is that right? Even if I only have a small Yuanying here, he should be the one to lead the way. You are the ones who carry the coffin, throw paper flowers, and cry at the funeral. Do you still need me to teach you this? If you insist on leading the way, have you ever thought that the ancestor in the coffin can't handle it? Startle him out again?" This guy's mouth was very foul, but it was basically the truth. However, Swan Shui was very insistent. "We need a promise. A guarantee. Otherwise, with so many orthodoxies elites, who can we cry to if we can't even hear a sound?" Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. "Promise? A guarantee? I can't even guarantee myself, how can I guarantee you? Besides, even if I guarantee, will you believe me? Why don't you go to the Sword Tao tablet and ask the Sword Ancestor for a guarantee? How old are you? You want someone to guarantee your future? Is there anyone in the cultivation world who can make such a guarantee? Not even a deity can guarantee you, let alone a half-immortal. It's just a bet, and you still want the banker to back you up?" Lu Xiaoyi scolded them and looked at them. "Since everyone is here, I'll put the ugly words out there. There was nothing. No one can promise anything. No one can guarantee you anything. We are just a bunch of sword veins motley crew with some ideas. We want to break out and do something. This is our own idea. The heavens are high, and the Emperor is far away. No one can command us, and there's no benefit to be gained. If you think Sword Vein can make a name for itself, then follow. If you think it's better to do it yourselves, no one will stop you. If it's deeper, I don't have it, and I don't know." The group of people felt that this swordsman was very scoundrel, but it seemed like the giant of the Sword Tao was also like this. It was as if their sword ancestor had gone to the immortal court to make a scene. Seeing that the atmosphere was a little tense, Go Yuan stood up to mediate, afraid that the situation would collapse. Fellow Taoist Dan! All right, let's not discuss who is the leader. Since our three families have come together to Willow Sea, there are some things that need not be said. I don't want any guarantees. Under the heavenly Tao, no one could protect anyone. Everyone had their own destinies, and their lives depended on the heavens. But there was one thing, and that was his future actions. If we put our lives on the line, it's fine if our long-term goals are unclear, but we can't keep our short-term goals in the dark, can we? What do you think, fellow Taoist Dan? Why don't you share it with us so that we can discuss it together? It's always good to hear more opinions. Lu Xiaoyi flatly refused. No plan. He had no plans. There was no target. You think I'm unreasonable? If you ask Heaven's Choice about their plans and goals, will they tell you? They didn't, but I had a countermeasure. If this isn't a joke, then what is? No long-term goals, no short-term plans, it's actually the same thing. Wherever you go, that's where you go. Damn it, if you don't die, you'll be 1,000,000 years old. Let's talk about plans. Back then, if there were a few deities in the immortal court who came together to discuss how to push down the first domino of the heavenly Tao, I reckon that this matter would most likely not succeed. Some decisions are not something that can be discussed. He stood up. It was time to end this conversation. Our four families have similar pasts in Heaven's Choice, the same predicament, and the same unbearable history. To be able to stand here after so many years, what does it mean? I respect your orthodoxies very much. To be able to reach this point, there is at least one similarity, and that is the unyielding willpower. But why? You were able to maintain your excellence for thousands of years, but on the eve of the great change, you became overcautious, timid, and hesitant? Where did your previous persistence go? You persevered until the end, just for the sake of hesitation now? If you think that there is hope in coming to Willow Sea, then maintain this hope. Tell me, is there any other hope? Is there any other path? To go against the mainstream of Heaven's Choice, we only have one path. I don't need to tell you which path it is, you know it very well. He floated away, leaving behind a sentence. I don't need you to make a decision now. Let's wait and see. When the great change begins, we can all go to the origin world to relax. Perhaps in a change of environment, we will have a new way of thinking? There is no need to tie us together now, and there is no need to say that those who walk different paths cannot make plans together. What is Tao? We haven't even figured it out yet. Seeing the swordsman leave, the 11 primordial spirits fell into deep thought, but none of them became angry out of humiliation. They were all old monsters that had lived for thousands of years. They were testing and provoking the swordsman, and the swordsman was doing the same to them. It was a matter of who lost their cool first. Long Jian smiled bitterly. After testing for half a day, we didn't find out anything, except that this one ear's strength is indeed unfathomable. I find it strange. If he really came from that orthodoxy, how did he cultivate to such a level in these 600 years in Zhou? Even if that orthodoxy wanted to send someone over, why would they send a Jin Dan over a few hundred years in advance? Moreover, they were sure that this Jin Dan could become a true monarch, and rarely meet a worthy opponent, and command a war that was countless years away? Go Yuan was also very puzzled. I can understand why he couldn't say it out loud. Those few words are taboo. I even suspect that the mainstream forces of Heaven's Choice have issued a decree to Lu Hai to guard against possible changes. However, the general direction and intentions should be clear, right? Are we going to focus on Zhou Xian? Or should we target Heaven's Choice? Do you think there is a possibility that the forces that Sword Juggernaut belongs to will attack Heaven's Choice? Go Shui flatly denied. Impossible. No one with a brain would attack Heaven's Choice. Because this would unite the Heaven's Choice continent. And a united Heaven's Choice with its huge size is simply impossible to defeat. We can only let Heaven's Choice go and not let it feel any pressure. Only then will the nearly 10,000 countries forever remain in a state of disunity, never able to gather together. Therefore, the main battlefield will not be at Heaven's choice. Long Jian sighed. That one ear is right. This kind of thing can't be discussed. It can only be done by someone patting their own head. This head can't be patted by others, it can only be patted by him. Go Shui shook his head. We still think too highly of ourselves. Reality has proven that the mainstream forces of Heaven's choice don't care about us. That sword juggernaut might not even care about us, so why should we fight for this leadership position? Who knows, maybe it will be a disaster, and not a blessing. Forget it, then we'll go to the origin world. If the sword vein can't convince us, we'll find another realm to fight alone. Chapter 1323. P.S. I discussed with Qinggu Pin to reduce the burden. It's not that I'm shameless, but I really can't afford it. I can't guarantee anything, but I'll try my best. 40 chapters a day? Then I'll see you in the coffin. 10 chapters? I can't do it either, I'll just write a few chapters. I hope everyone can understand. Lu Xiaoyi didn't try to persuade them wholeheartedly. Because it was useless. When you shout, those who respond will follow you. When you show your aura, everyone will come to you. That was a novel, not a fact. With his current reputation, strength, and years of hard work, it was already a miracle that he could win the support of the Shadow-Shaking Sword Sect and the Heaven's Choice Sword Sect. This was also the limit of his ability. This was the cultivation world, not a chaotic world where one couldn't eat their fill after years of starvation. If you raised your banner, countless people would respond. There was only one goal: to fill one's stomach. For cultivators, especially grand cultivators like nascent soul cultivators and perfected immortals, every one of them had their own views on cultivation and the universe. Every one of them was an expert in Confucianism and Taoism. Who could you fool? Then he might as well not fool them and reject them outright. This was also a kind of profound psychological warfare. It wasn't that he didn't care about these three forces. In a real interstellar cultivator war, the 200 to 300 people of his sword vein were really not enough. They needed the support of other orthodoxies. The more they needed, the more they had to reject. They had to understand that they were fighting for themselves, not for others. These three orthodoxies had been suppressed for countless years and endured for countless years. If they were still united even now, they must have strong ambitions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to persevere. Therefore, he wasn't worried at all. Where could they choose? The Heaven's Choice Sword Sect was their archenemy for countless years. Zhou Xian wasn't aggressive enough and couldn't support a wall. If they went out to the main world to fight, they would be separated from the main battlefield. In the future, when they split the spoils, no one would consider them. They were bound to end up in the same situation as the Heaven's Choice Sword Sect. Apart from Xian Yuan and the Fifth Ring, they had no other choice. Returning to the sword path steel, Ban Zhu was ashamed. Boss, we didn't do our job well and made you worry. But these people's attitudes are truly vile. It's as if our sword vein is begging them, and they're making things difficult for us. Lu Xiai smiled. It's just a strategy. If you want to sell yourself to someone and get a good price, of course you have to act like you don't care. Rushing isn't a business. Mottled Bamboo asked. Boss, have you reached an agreement? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. No. I've already said that it's not business to be in a hurry. If they won't be in a hurry, do you think my sword vein will be in a hurry? The negotiations had failed. I won't even provide food for you. The perfected lords were speechless. They were well aware of the importance of these three sections. Without their participation, the sword vein would be greatly restricted. In a war between realms, numbers were an unavoidable hurdle. Unless they all had the same strength as the sword master. Lu Xiaoyi comforted her. Don't cry. However, now that it had collapsed, it was hard to say if they could still talk about it in the future. Now is not the time to form an alliance. It's too early. Don't you see that the mainstream sects of Heaven's Choice haven't raised their flags yet? If they're not in a hurry, why should we be? The sword Dao steel returned to its calm state. Lu Xiaoyi no longer sent the swordsman out to scout for information. There was nothing to scout out anyway. The information that was released now was all fake. There might not be any more allies, which made the swordsmen more focused on themselves. Now, other than themselves, they could not rely on anyone else. Under such pressure, they practiced their swordsmanship even more desperately. Lu Xiaoyi saw this and did not say much. This was the cruelty of the cultivation world. Who knew how many people would survive after the war? Other than themselves, cultivators could not rely on anyone else, including him. In the Heaven's Choice mainland, his sword vein was not the only one in a difficult position, including the high and mighty exalted nation. On this day, at 1,000,000 feet high in the heavens Volition-Chi layer, 33 figures were sitting in a circle. This was a long and drawn-out debate. They had already had several debates of this scale. Now, it was time to end it. The 36 exalted nations of Heaven's Choice was just an overall title. In reality, there were not enough 36. There was no need for a steel. There was no cultivation power, so there was no representative. Morality had collapsed too early. Although the exalted nations existed, there was no cultivation power. The destiny steel had also collapsed for thousands of years. Its strength had declined greatly. It had made up its mind not to participate, so no one cared. Merit, void, massacre, impermanence. Although these 4 Dao steels had collapsed, it was only a matter of a few hundred years. It did not affect the strength of the exalted nations, especially the strength of the high-level cultivators. Therefore, they could still maintain the dignity of the exalted nations. Therefore, there were only 33 sun gods or great Buddhas here. They represented the remaining 33 exalted nations. However, there were only 2 people who spoke here. Taoist Pang, Buddha Hao Da. In fact, they represented the 2 camps of Heaven's Choice, Taoism and Buddhism. Among the 33 exalted nations, 12 were Buddhist nations. They were reincarnation, unification, nirvana, karma, nothingness, yin virtue, merit, fortune, impermanence, destiny, and misfortune. The Taoist great kingdoms were interception of luck, destiny, Taisu, Taichu, Tai, Tai Chi, Taisher, 5 elements, yin and yang, slaughter, destruction, creation, life and death, strength, time, space, chaos, origin, Taishu, sage, and lightning. On the surface, it seemed that Taoism had the upper hand, but in reality, that was not the case. The 12 Buddhist nations worked together. Their wills were like a fortress, and they were twisted into a rope. However, the 21 Taoist nations were constantly divided, and some were even irreconcilable. Some were progressive, some were conservative, and of course, there were also those who sat on the fence and enjoyed the scenery. Hence, Taoist Pang could only represent about 10 nations. Due to the fact that the Buddhists were generally stronger than the Taoists in terms of strength, the Taoists did not have any advantage in this dispute. This was also the usual conduct of Taoism, so it was not strange at all. Unless there was a direct confrontation between Taoism and Buddhism in the Heaven's Choice continent, it was impossible for these bulls to twist into a rope. Not working together, has Taoism thought it through? Buddha Haoda's voice was calm. Even though he knew this was the truth, he still wanted to confirm it. Because their next decision would be bound by the highest level of oath. It was not only an oath, but also a more practical oath. Both Taoism and Buddhism had to abide by each other's promises. If there was a violation, there would be a backlash. We won't work together, because that would form another Heaven's Choice. Whether it is Taoism or Buddhism, it has no meaning. Taoist Pang did not hesitate. Heaven's Choice continent, it was inevitable that there would be divergence. This was the natural balance of the universe's cultivation forces. Otherwise, if the Heaven's Choice continent came together, no origin world could stop them. But whether it was Taoism or Buddhism, they did not mention anything about their own direction. This was also a rule. If both sides were to head towards the 5th ring, then Heaven's Choice Taoism and Buddhism would definitely have a battle in the origin world. Very magical? But this was the cultivation world. They would not fight to the death in the Heaven's Choice continent, but would fight to the death in the origin world. For millions of years, the hatred between both sides was actually very deep. Chapter 13:24. Heaven's Choice will maintain the status quo and fight for the future. Do you agree? Tanda continued. Yes. Don't bring the matters of the outer realm into the realm. This is the last retreat. This is a consensus. Taoist Pang was calm. In that case, let's make an oath. The 33 young gods present each represented their country. They each made a promise and made a joint oath. At the same time, Tanda gave a Buddhist edict to the 21 Taoist young gods, and Taoist Pang made an oath to the 12 Buddhas. This was an oath, a restriction outside of the oath. The only purpose was that regardless of whether the two sides won or lost, there would still be a place for Heaven's Choice when they returned. The Taoists and Buddhists each had their own thoughts. This was formed by Heaven's Choice over millions of years and couldn't be changed. The great change was imminent. In terms of position, whether to choose the realm or the orthodoxy became the key to decide the direction of both sides. In the end, they chose to attack with the orthodoxy as the priority. But in the defense of their homeland, the continent was the priority. The Buddhists had no intention of joining forces, but they still invited hypocritically. If they were really willing to join forces, why didn't they reveal any of their previous plans? It was just a polite invitation. The Taoists refused simply. First, they had their own considerations. Second, the Buddhists also had no sincerity. Thus, the overall situation was set. Both sides used their strength to open up the passage to the main world. If their goals were different, then they wouldn't meet in the main world for the time being. But if their goals were the same, the moment they left the anti-space, it would be the time for Heaven's Choice and the Buddhists to fight to the death. It was time to resolve the grudges of millions of years with the change of the new era. In the eyes of others, this kind of situation was very brainless. This was a good expedition to the main world, but before they even set off, there was already serious internal conflict. This was the path to death. But in the Heaven's Choice continent, the actual situation forced them to act this way. There was no other way. The grudges between Taoists and Buddhists couldn't be mediated. If they really joined forces, the benefits they gained were even more impossible to mediate. This kind of alliance had no foundation and no benefits. Instead of joining forces and creating trouble again, it was better to go their separate ways from the beginning. They dared to do this because of the huge size of the entire Heaven's Choice cultivation world. Even if it was divided into three parts, the Buddhist power, Taoist power, and the remaining power, each power was still incomparably powerful. This was the result of the anti-space Heaven's Choice continent dominating the continent for millions of years. It was also the result of the origin world's countless realms developing separately. It was impossible to change this. It was precisely because of this that they placed great importance on the safety of the Heaven's Choice continent's retreat route. That was why they had so many backup plans. For example, for the sake of the stability of the rear, they resisted the urge to deal with some troublemakers and had always turned a blind eye to them. They had even bestowed large floating rafts to the 7 families that jumped the most. They would rather send them away than make a move. The real reason was because they didn't want to stir up internal strife in the Heaven's Choice continent. Among the 3 forces, in terms of numbers, the forces left behind were actually the largest. It was just that they were not of one mind, each minding their own business. If you took the initiative to start a purge, it would be like gathering all these people together. The threat they posed was completely different from the threat of the 7 families. In the negative space, we are the chosen ones. Once we enter the origin world, we will become deer chasers. In that case, does Taoism acknowledge it? Tanda took one step after another. He couldn't be blamed for being aggressive. With the nature of Taoism, if you didn't force him, he would endure until the end of time. It's my duty to pursue my ideals. Father, son, and brothers each serve his own master. When they leave, they fight for supremacy, and when they return, they are home. Taoism has no objections. In that case, let's make an oath. Both sides went through the same procedure again. In fact, if they really wanted to come to a conclusion today, they would have to go through the same procedure many times. Buddha is Taoism, and Taoism is Buddha. Between us, there are differences, but there are also common understandings. If there are those who follow the good path, we can't stop them. Does Taoism have any objections? Taoist Peng took a deep breath. This question was actually directed at Taoism. The one who would suffer losses would definitely be Taoism. Because as the leader, there were too many schools of thought in Taoism. Tanda's meaning was very simple. If there were those in Taoism who were willing to follow Buddhism, they couldn't stop them. Similarly, if there were those in Buddhism who were willing to follow Taoism, the mainstream Buddhism could only watch. It seemed fair, but in reality, Buddhism was a monolithic block while Taoism was lax. It went without saying who was at a disadvantage and who was at an advantage. Yes. But this kind of following the good path should be done from beginning to end. In that case, we can reach an agreement. Taoist Peng's counterattack was equally sharp. What he meant was, since Buddhism thought that they could pull people from Taoism, then this kind of tolerance shouldn't be limited to the early stage of the Great Change, but must be from beginning to end. If one day you, the Buddhist League, fail in your expedition, we, the Taoist League, can justifiably accept those weak forces in your Buddhist League who are struggling to survive. In fact, it was a competition of confidence. Tanda didn't hesitate. Yes, let's make an oath. This operation lasted for a long time. No matter how big or small, it had to be arranged and considered in advance. Behind each of them, there were nearly 100 sun gods supporting them. Under such an agreement, it was impossible for anything to be missed. A month later, the 33 sun gods joined their palms together and made an oath. The contract was formed. The Great Change had begun. Under the cooperation of Taoism and Buddhism, the Heaven's Choice continent was completely sealed off. Even the passage of the ancient beasts had to be inspected. Of course, the ancient beasts themselves weren't included in the inspection, but the people they brought in and out. Since then, the passage of the Heaven's Choice continent was isolated. No one could enter, and no one could leave. Those cultivators floating in the negative space could only continue to float outside until the main force of the Heaven's Choice continent was mobilized and no longer sealed off. Those who still wanted to go to the main world to look for opportunities could only kill their plans. This was an inevitable measure before the army was mobilized. It put an end to all information transmission and made the final preparations to form a limited degree of abruptness. The various large countries began to mobilize their influence in the surrounding small and medium-sized countries, striving to deepen their own camp. At this time, there was no need to hide anything. Except for the direction and time of the target, which were still unknown, the others began to show their cards. They each stood on their own side, chose to rely on them, and gambled on their future. This was a separation of the old order. Inside many small and medium-sized countries, there were different opinions on this, and it was difficult to balance the forces. This was also a hidden strategy of the 36 large countries. For the safety of their retreat, they dismembered the stability of the small and medium-sized forces. It was also at this time that the large cultivators of the large countries began to go to different places. The Sword Dao Steel's Willow Sea, the Body Lineage Alliance, the Blood River Steel, and the other 7 mischievous forces were harassed again. Furthermore, there was a Chamber of Commerce who passed on a message that the Heaven's Choice continent would open a passage and allow these 7 families to leave at a certain time. They had to leave even if they didn't want to. In the current environment, no matter how strong one was, there would be a butcher's knife falling. In the Heaven's Choice continent, no one could resist the will of the large countries. Chapter 1325. Qin Xian's heart was filled with anxiety as he flew through the vast negative space. He had been out for more than 200 years. Just over 10 years ago, he made an important decision. He did not consider returning, but continued to fly. In his original plan, he would need to return after flying for nearly 200 years. He would return to Zhou Xian to meet up with the sword lunatic. The two of them had come out together, so they had to return together. This was something he had always insisted on. Even if they were once enemies, he was not willing to abandon his companions who had been with him for hundreds of years. However, some things were easier said than done. Even if he had set a time limit of 300 years, it seemed like he had overestimated himself. He had already flown out of the route that the two of them had planned. It only took him 20 years to reach the end of the route. The rest of the time was to go deeper, deeper, and deeper. So deep that the risk of his return journey was no less than the risk of going forward. He had already lost his way. However, there was one thing that he was certain of, and that was that the general direction they were heading in was correct. They would definitely not reach the vicinity of Qin Kong, but overall, even though there were deviations, they would definitely be getting closer and closer to Qin Kong. He had no choice but to give up on his promise with the swordsman. With his current situation, there was no other way for him to go. Traveling alone was an arduous journey. In the vast negative space, there were traps and accidents everywhere. Some were from the void beasts, some were from humans. Of course, most of them were from the negative space's curved surface. He had no choice but to come out of the main world every few years to compare the positive and negative space to make sure that his direction was not too far off. His ability to do so was not only due to the three clear orthodoxies' comprehensive strength, but also due to his own efforts. Ever since he became a nascent soul, he had been trying his best to strengthen a Tao realm, the Tao realm of space. This was to prepare for a long journey. That unreliable swordsman would probably not care. If the two of them flew together, that guy would definitely pass the responsibility of leading the way to him. Then, he would just enjoy the scenery and complain about it. He could only do it himself. Hence, his preparations for the return journey were many times more meticulous than the unreliable swordsman. This was also why he had persevered until now. Although he had long deviated from the course, there was no fundamental error in the general direction. He had broken his promise, but he believed that the swordsman would understand. If that swordsman was in his shoes, he would have already made up his mind to walk down this path. He knew that grandson very well. What supported him in making such a decision was his true sense as a cultivator. As a true monarch, he had a premonition that changes would happen in the near future. If he went back now, he would not be able to reach either end. In this turbulent era, he didn't want to be a bystander. He wanted to participate. Just like swordsman, his judgment was based on Qin Kong's. That's right, in the azure sky. The multiple-choice question was very simple for him. He couldn't help much with Zhou Xian. There were countless great cultivators and true monarchs there. Even if his strength was outstanding, how many people could he be a match for? In the same way, he didn't need to worry about the fifth ring. That was the core of their power. They were the plundering power that had dominated the universe for tens of thousands of years. If even they were attacked, he could only say that the fifth ring was fated to face this calamity. He couldn't help either. The only person he could help was Qin Kong. Because he knew that Qin Kong's cultivator strength couldn't be compared to the fifth ring. It was just a place to live out the rest of his life. Even if the fifth ring could provide some support, its strength would be very limited. Because the one who had caused the infamy for tens of thousands of years wasn't Qin Kong, but the fifth ring. His individual strength couldn't be of much use in the main battlefield, but it might not be the case in the secondary battlefield. This was the conclusion the two of them had reached after chatting for several days. No matter how the Heaven's Choice continent was played, there was one thing: Zhou Xian, 5 rings, Qin Kong, none of them would be able to escape. They would all be under the enemy's attack. The only difference was who would attack. But they could only return to Qin Kong. If there was time, they would see if they could send out a warning. They had guessed countless times that the Heaven's Choice continent might have other tricks up their sleeves. They were also guessing how the Fifth Ring sect would respond to this. But guessing wouldn't solve the problem. The distance was too far, so far that the Fifth Ring sect couldn't monitor the Heaven's Choice continent. Even if they did monitor them, how would they send back the news? No matter how stupid the Heaven's Choice continent was, they would know to have a clear target before attacking. How would they be able to run ahead of them? The best way was to set up a warning system in the surrounding space of the Fifth Ring sect. This would also achieve the purpose of warning. This was a very troublesome problem. With the Fifth Ring sect's tradition, they would have attacked long ago. Why would they have to passively defend? But reality proved that they couldn't attack forever. There were two key factors that made the Fifth Ring sect unable to take the initiative to attack. One was the extremely long distance, and the second was the enormous size of the Heaven's Choice continent. When you didn't attack, the Heaven's Choice continent was still loose. But as long as you took the initiative to attack, the Heaven's Choice continent would immediately become a huge monster. They would also sink into the sea of cultivators and be unable to extricate themselves. It was very passive, but there was nothing they could do. The effect of an individual in the waves of the universe was still too limited. In any case, he couldn't think of any way to solve this problem. He could only use his body to fill in the gap. He also believed in the Fifth Ring sect's ability and left the rest to Heaven's will. He just didn't know how far that swordsman would go if he was here. He had never been to the Heaven's Choice continent, but that didn't mean he didn't understand it. Whether it was the memories from the Three Pure Ones or the understanding from Taishian, he knew the terrifying number of Heaven's Choice continent cultivators. It was equivalent to gathering all the worlds of the origin world together. Just thinking about it was terrifying. He was somewhat regretting it. He shouldn't have come out. You went out for a stroll when the big show was going on. You deserved to be replaced by someone else. He was somewhat suspicious. Did that grandson know that a good show was about to start, so he purposely kicked him further away? In this place where there was no village ahead and no shop behind, the lonely Qing Xian was flying by himself. He didn't talk to himself often when he needed to maintain a certain level of language ability. Even if it was a cultivator, if they didn't speak for 200 years, their language ability would fade. Not only language, but also thinking. He had to constantly deduce various kinds of complicated martial arts in his mind to maintain his brain's activity. In the void of the universe, even if there were no astronomical phenomena, even if it was eternally peaceful, when you flew by yourself for hundreds of years, your eyes, ears, and brain would slowly fall into an eternal silence. In the end, you would become a part of the universe, no longer thinking, and become dull. This was a very common symptom in the cultivation world. It was called the emptiness syndrome. He secretly told himself that if he could safely survive this calamity, it would be time to find one or a few pets. His mouth must be smelly. His hands must be cheap. His heart must be bad. And wasn't this the portrayal of that swordsman? Chapter 13:26. Lu Xiaoyi stood on the sword Dao tablet, trying to feel the silent oppression. Since a few days ago, unknown cultivators had appeared in the sky above the Willow Sea. No one knew who they were. Where did they come from? Lu Xiaoyi did not ask his subordinates to expel them, because he knew their purpose very well. There were some things that he had already thought through clearly. There was no need to think about it anymore. He was scaring himself. Banju approached him gently. "Boss, the Chamber of Commerce sent news. In 3 months, there will be a passage leading to the outside of Heaven's Choice. It's said to be a way of business, but you know, it should be the opening that the upper countries opened for us." Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. "Exiled? Do you blame me? If I didn't gather you together, maybe only 6 families would be expelled?" Banju sneered. "Boss, with or without you, we are destined to be the ones to be chased out of this place. The reason is very simple. We learned the sword from the sword Dao tablet. Just for this, we should be the first on the blacklist. Moreover, even if you don't organize it, we will organize it ourselves. Under such a situation, it would be completely brainless to scatter in all directions. That's why no one knows that you are here. Because they know that we from the sword vein will definitely gather here. Huang Yan interrupted from the side. Senior brother is right. It's just a matter of a few years. The war is imminent. Who would dare to leave the most dangerous enemy in their own heart? It doesn't matter if you have this intention or not. At least now we know what to do. Where to do it. Not like a bunch of headless flies. Model Bamboo suggested. 3 months isn't that long. Boss, you don't want us to repair that large floating raft. That thing is really broken. I suspect that it will disperse when it breaks through the space. Why don't we gather some more Ziqing in exchange for some key parts? Prepare more spares? I estimate that it won't be a problem to fly to Zhouxian, but I'm afraid that it won't last long if it goes any further. Lu Xiaoyi was a little amused. These guys were trying to dig out his bottom line. They just wanted to know where their destination was. According to their understanding, if not, the destination would be the battlefield in Zhouxian. If they cultivate diligently, it might be in the distance, the holy land that they hide in their hearts. I don't want to fix it. That's it. Lu Xiaoyi made a decision. Model Bamboo and Huang Yan looked at each other. Their destination was Zhouxian. This was the most logical conclusion. He was a little disappointed that he could not directly contribute to his sword vein. Thus, he asked the question that had been lingering in his heart. In the past few days, the changes in the continent had been very obvious. The actions of pulling the mountain were no longer hidden. Boss, you also think it's Zhouxian? Why was it that Zhouxian had tried every possible means to get rid of this trouble, yet they were unable to do so in the end? I heard that Zhouxian has the origin world's most powerful defensive innate spiritual treasure, the heaven and earth chessboard. I'm afraid this will be a long and drawn-out war. But in the distance, the other choice has no defense at all, not even the world grand membrane. Lu Xiaoyi smiled but did not answer. This was usually a pretense when he really did not know. It was an unfathomable act. Huang Yan was also very curious. The situation of heaven's choice is clear. The main forces will be divided into Taoists and Buddhists, each blowing their own trumpets, singing their own tunes, and pulling their own ledges. So if they don't meet with each other, one of them will definitely deal with Zhouxian? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. That's the general idea. Don't try to trick me. I actually don't know anything. I don't even know who to trick. Distribute the quality of the pills. I'm going out to relax and take a look at the magnificent mountains and rivers. Seeing the sword master disappear into the night sky, the few of them curled their lips. They did not know what he was doing. The sword master had a big plan. This was their consensus. It was just that he was too tight-lipped, not even letting out a fart. In their opinion, he was going to find the other sex to discuss it, right? After all, if they did not communicate with each other, they would not have another chance. If he went to the void of the universe, how could he still be in the mood? The great change was imminent. They were excited, but also regretful. They were excited because they were lucky enough to participate in such a grand event. Regretful because the sects in their hearts could not see what they were doing. Then, were they considered disciples of the sword vein? If the sword master said they were, then they were. Sometimes drawing their swords was just a form of acknowledgement, This was the hot blood of mortals. It should not appear in cultivators. But they were swordsmen, different. A month later, also 110 years after Lu Xiaoyi entered the Sword Dao Steel for the second time. When he appeared at the Sword Dao Steel, a huge anti-space floating raft was already floating in the air. Its exterior was covered in rust. This was because they did not have the money to repair it. The limited amount of spiritual opportunity was spent on the core components. Why would the swordsman, who did not care about appearances, care about whether it looked impressive or not? It was not a fancy boat. 291 swordsmen floated in the air. Among them, 35 were monarchs. They were ready to set off. The air was filled with a chilly atmosphere. Their gazes were resolute. Even if they knew that they might not be able to return, none of them were reluctant to leave. Lu Xiaoyi did not lecture them. There was no need for that. They had lived together for more than 100 years. What needed to be said had been said. There was no need to say more. Next, they should speak with their swords. Looking at the row of monarchs in front, he pointed at the floating raft, and was speechless. Can't you keep this thing? Isn't it too big? We don't need it now. You're making it look like a rich man fleeing for his life. A monarch retorted. Boss, we can't keep it. The raft ring's function has failed. We don't have the money to repair it. The swordsman laughed heartlessly. Lu Xiaoyi also laughed. Then sit on it. We'll drink as we walk. The swordsman roared in agreement. They did not enter the raft. They sat on top of the raft, and drank as they enjoyed the strong astral wind. They were bidding farewell to the land of heaven's choice. They were bidding farewell to their past. The floating raft swayed, and black smoke came out from the end of the raft. A few people on the raft were cursing and swearing. Fortunately, they managed to get the guy to move. Because it was a void floating raft, it was very difficult to move in the atmosphere. The black smoke never stopped. Lu Xiaoyi threw the wine pot and shouted, "The king sent me to patrol the mountains." The swordsman echoed, "I'll take a look around the mortal world." Lu Xiaoyi's hoarse voice continued, "The king sent me to patrol the mountains." The floating raft gradually went away. The villagers along the Willow Sea only heard the last sentence. Catch a monk for dinner. They understood that these perverted immortals who had lived here for more than 100 years had left. Moreover, it was very likely that they would never return. Perhaps they were indeed perverted and immoral. However, for more than 100 years, not a single mortal had been bullied. On the contrary, countless families had benefited from it. Some people knelt down and silently gave their blessings, feeling lost. Chapter 13:27. The floating raft deliberately flew above heaven's choice, passing by mountains and rivers. They were all familiar places in the swordsman's sect, places where they had fought, places where their companions were buried, places where they had slept. Gradually, everyone became quiet. As they stared, a different kind of pride rose within them. This was the final farewell, but no one said goodbye. If everything could be redone, would they still choose the sword? They would. If their lives ended sooner or later, would they be buried in their old home? They wouldn't. This was a one-way ticket. Once they went up, they couldn't come back down. From the moment they chose the sword, the heavens had already decided. The sword vein was the last to arrive, but it was also the most eye-catching. It was the black wind. At this time, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't show his face. A few veteran perfected lords were in charge of greeting and communicating. The atmosphere was very quiet. The 7 large floating rafts didn't communicate with each other, and the atmosphere was somewhat heavy. To be precise, they were a group of stray dogs. They were unstable elements that had been expelled from the continent. Was Shanghua's sun god guarding the pass? It was understated and not very detailed. On the floating raft, Huang Yan was somewhat puzzled. They don't seem to be serious? Aren't they afraid that we'll secretly bring non-sword vein cultivators out of the region to spread the news? Lu Xie sighed. What news can you spread? What do you know? We know, and the people of Zhou Xian in the main world have long made their judgment. What they don't know, we don't know either. A large-scale cultivation war doesn't have complete abruptness. Even if Zhou Xian realize something, what can they prepare? In the end, it's just a clash of strength. Songrong asked. After we leave, will Heaven's Choice begin? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. No. Decades, it's still too early. Until no one remembers us anymore. Until the other side's defense slackens because of the delay. The most frightening thing is when the sword hangs above your head, because you don't know when it will fall. When it does, it doesn't matter, because there's no need to think about it. Huang Yan asked a question that had been on his mind for a long time. The Pill Cultivator Organization, the Beast Tamer Association, and the Body Lineage Alliance. Do we really not need to interact with these three? I've always felt that if we work together, we'll be able to do something big. No matter where we go, we'll be able to make our voices heard. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. The 7 families together have more than 200 perfected cultivators and 2,000 to 3,000 yuanying. They're not weak at all. If we don't consider the sun god, they're almost as strong as a weak country. But what we need to consider is, how many of them have the determination to go all out? History could prove the sufferings of an orthodoxy. Blood River, soul cultivators, martial saints, they were all like this. There was no chance of them being bribed. Pill cultivators wouldn't either, because they only recognized money. Moreover, Heaven's Choice probably wouldn't give them a suitable price. On the eve of a great battle, every bit of spiritual opportunity was precious. But beast taming and body veins are different. Their history of suffering isn't long. As far as I know, it's only been a few hundred years. To them, there really exists an illusory hope to rope them in. For example, building their own country? Returning to the mainstream? If there are internal problems on the battlefield, it's too dangerous. I won't take the risk, and I won't play hide-and-seek with them. It's better for us to go our separate ways. Everyone understood what he meant. Among the 7 teams, there might be some who wanted to play the trick of injuring themselves. This was probably the final measure of Heaven's Choice against them. There was no conclusive evidence for this kind of thing. When internal strife broke out, it was too late to regret. It was very troublesome. Zhou Fan raised a very realistic question. What if they insist on following us? Lu Xi's eyes turned cold. I've heard that when going to war, blood must be sacrificed to the flag. We seem to be missing a procedure? The rafts formed a long snake. In front, there was a cultivator from heaven leading the way. Behind him, there were 7 large floating rafts following closely. After flying like this for more than a year, Lu Xiaoyi finally got rid of the heaven selection gravitational field. He heaved a sigh of relief, not because of his own safety, but because none of the 7 tattered floating rafts had broken down. After getting out of the gravitational field, a few cultivators from Heaven's Choice stood in a row and watched coldly. Their meaning was clear. The circuit was broken. It was like a bastard being chased out of his family. Noticing the anger of the swordsmen on the rafts, Lu Xiaoyi sighed and didn't say anything. This was the result of causing trouble when they weren't strong enough. To be honest, there was no right or wrong. Who asked them to be so stubborn? Once they entered the negative space, 6 of the 7 floating rafts were very hesitant. This was because they couldn't determine their future direction. Not every orthodoxy had their own legends. They were also very confused when they were thrown into the vast universe as a warning to others. This wasn't a sudden opportunity. They had known about their situation for many years. However, the key was that their direction in the universe wasn't something that could be figured out in a few years or decades. For example, the Blood River sect. Go to Zhou Xian? They would be crushed to pieces in a great battle. Go to the origin world and find a realm to live in. Large realms couldn't be formed, but there was the great membrane of heaven and earth. They also had to think carefully about medium-sized realms. Was there a sun god there? They weren't willing to go to the lower realms. Their hearts were higher than the sky, but their lives were thinner than paper. Humans were a clumsy race. When they really came to the void of the universe and couldn't go back, other than desolation, there was only helplessness and confusion left. It was the same for the other sects. This kind of confusion was somewhat brainless during the voyage. They wanted to split up and achieve their own small goals, but they were unwilling. They wanted to go their separate ways, but they were also worried that after they left, the others would gather together to do big things. They were worried that they would be abandoned and isolated from the mainstream. No one was born a heretic. They were treated as heretics for their own historical reasons. However, when these people who shared the same fate were exiled into the universe, they were still reluctant to part with each other. Speed up! Go to the Mao 7 mark! Lu Xiaoyi decisively made a decision. This time, the cultivators controlling the rafts flew very steadily. They knew that the time to decide their future was coming. Why Mao 7? Why not the Zhou Xian mark? No one asked. From the moment they stepped out of the Heaven's Choice continent, they had completely handed themselves over to their sword masters. The 7 floating rafts began to diverge. Originally, this group's subconscious direction was the most obvious Zhou Xian mark nearby, which was also the one everyone was most familiar with. Everyone was sticking to the rules, thinking of stopping at the Zhou Xian mark for a short while to make a final communication. But now, the last floating raft suddenly accelerated, deviating from the rest of the group by an angle, and gradually overtaking them. It was as if their goal was firm. Although the swordsmen never lacked the courage to fight alone, they still needed friends. Especially when the universe was in chaos. No one showed it, but every swordsman's attention was focused on the tail of the raft. If no other floating raft caught up within 45 minutes, then they would forever lose these potential comrades. Silence, anxiety, hesitation, thinking left and right, internal struggle. These kinds of emotions were experienced by all the other floating rafts except for the swordsmen. Especially Blood River, Soul Cultivator, and Martial Saint Training Hall. They were very angry that the swordsmen really didn't care and treated them as nothing. They were waiting for the other two to make a decision. Everyone thought so, but in the end, no one made a move. The group of floating rafts still maintained a straight line towards Zhou Xian. Suddenly, one of the rafts changed direction and followed the Sword Veins raft that was cutting through the waves alone. Model Bamboo was very surprised. Beast Tamer Madman? Why is it them? Chapter 1328. With the first beast-taming orthodoxy turning, the rest were easy to follow. The Martial Saint Training Hall's floating raft turned, and sent out the language of light, follow. Soul Cultivators, Blood River Path, Pill Cultivators. In the end, only the individual Lineage Alliance was left, still struggling and refusing to turn. The fight in the rafts was in full swing, and it was starting to develop from talking to fighting. Those who played with the body all had bad tempers. In the end, the individual orthodoxies still submitted to the collective will. These damned swordsmen, didn't they know how to discuss this beforehand? Would it kill them to say a few more words? The raft team was still the same raft team, the only difference was that the direction had changed, and the leader had changed. Before the raft team completely accelerated, a figure flashed across the void, and crashed into the leading swordsman's raft. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Senior, someone like you who cherishes your body shouldn't get involved in this mess. I'll be blunt, if we really fight, no one will protect you. Have you prepared your coffin? Wen Ji sat down in front of him, carefully sizing up this little guy who was no longer a little guy, and sighed. I'm not here to follow you. I'm here to follow my faith. I've traveled around the world, and occasionally observed the sky at night, and knew that there were people who comprehended their faith. My first impression was you, and now it seems that I guessed correctly. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say yes or no. If I really have faith now, you shouldn't follow me. Because I don't need you to tempt me anymore. Senior, I'm not joking, this time it might be really dangerous. You're not good at fighting, so why bother? Wen Ji stretched his waist comfortably, and said meaningfully, do you know that the battlefield doesn't always rely on fighting, and sometimes other things need to be done too? To my faith, everyone who comprehended their faith is the master of faith. They are all people I follow. And this time, I'm here to give you a gift. Lu Xiaoyi was curious. Gift? Senior, are you planning to give me the news of the Tao fragment for free? Wen Ji waved his hand. Faith is faith, business is business. When did you hear that faith can be treated as business? What I want to tell you is that among the remaining 6 teams, the Martial Saint Training Hall can be completely trusted. Lu Xiaoyi remained calm. Why? Wen Ji said word by word. Because they all have faith. Otherwise, how do you think they could survive for so long in Heaven's Choice with their martial skills? I can help you contact them and have them become your most capable helpers. During this period of time, cultivators from various orthodoxies came to communicate. Lu Xiaoyi did not mention a word about the purpose of this meeting. It was up to them to follow or not. They were cultivators, but they couldn't do anything. 2 years later, they finally arrived at route number 7. Lu Xiaoyi passed down his instructions. They still had to follow the current formation and enter the space passage in order to enter the main world. However, it was unanimously opposed by the other 6 families. The reason is clear: all of them are old masters' broken rafts, their gathering capacity is limited, there won't be a single raft to open a path, the remaining rafts can only gather together one by one, and cross one by one. In that case, if your sword veins floating raft is the first to cross, and runs away on its own, who are we going to look for? It would take about an hour for each floating raft to pass through. Such a long time was more than enough for them to disappear without a trace. The Martial Saint Training Hall stepped forward and requested to be the first to pass, followed by the sword vein, familiar, soul cultivator, blood river, body vein. Everyone agreed to this change, and the sword vein wouldn't object. Thus, the first step to the origin world was to open at the Mouse 7 marker. It was also the sword soldier's first step into the origin world. Passing through the Martial Saint Training Hall went very smoothly. Although the old master's raft's energy was a little forced to break through the wall, it still managed to open up a passage in the end, leaving a gap that was only big enough for one raft to pass through. This meant that the other rafts would not be able to borrow the light, and would have to start all over again. Wen Ji clicked his tongue and sighed. Chenghua's methods are really good, what a talent! To be able to make all 7 of the rafts so old, they can only pass through one by one. I estimate that the number of times they can break through the wall is limited, and there's also the amount of time the main power can keep operating. These things, it's fine to take a shortcut, but it'll be bad if you go too far. Little friend, you can't afford to be careless. Lu Xiaoyi sneered. Once we reach the origin world, we can just fly with our bodies. How many swordsmen have you seen sitting on a floating raft and enjoying life? As for how many times they can break through the wall, once is enough. If we win, we can take as many floating rafts as we want. If we fail, we'll return to the heavens, and we won't need to use a floating raft anymore. Wen Ji sighed in his heart. The swordsman's actions were truly ruthless, but it was precisely because of this ruthlessness that they were able to erupt with battle prowess that far surpassed other orthodoxies. Little friend, why did you let the Martial Saint Training Hall take the lead? You should be worried about whether the people behind us will follow, not the ones in front. The Martial Saint Training Hall had secretly reached an agreement with the sword vein during the 2 years of the voyage. They were the sword vein's only reliable ally, so of course they should be used separately, and not one side should be first and the other side should be second, giving the other factions a chance to negotiate individually. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't worried at all. Of course not. They're at a loss right now, with nowhere to go and no backbone. If they form a group by themselves, who's going to listen to who? After passing through the Martial Saint Training Hall smoothly, the sword vein was next. With the same dawdling and the same old ox pulling the broken cart, the spatial passage finally formed after exerting a Herculean effort. Then, it disappeared into the passage. As Wen Ji expected, the remaining 5 factions came out to stir up trouble. It wasn't that they wanted to start a new faction, but rather they wanted to. This won't do! Since the 7 of us are now in the same boat, we should be honest with each other. What's the point of being so secretive about it? Are the 6 of us just tagging along? A body cultivator from the Body Vein Alliance was the first to make trouble, shouting loudly. A Pildao perfected lord also responded. That's right. The sword vein's history has a lot to do with the change of eras this time, so we're willing to follow along and find a way out. This is also the reason why everyone hasn't left yet. However, shouldn't we restrict the sword vein's authority? I think they're feeling a little too good right now, thinking that they're number 1 in the world. They're just heaven's chosen swordsmen, not 5th ring swordsmen. What's with the pretense? a Blood River Path cultivator retorted. When have we not tried all these things you're talking about? We've been asking for answers these 2 years, but the Sword Vein refused to say anything, only saying that there would be an answer within 3 years. Now that almost 2 years have passed, why not wait? Most importantly, even if we fall out with them, what's the use? Who should we go to? Which great realm would be at ease taking in people like us who have been expelled? The group of people argued, unable to understand for a moment. Chapter 13:29. While they were arguing, the third beast-taming orthodoxy didn't participate. When the space in front of them calmed down, they immediately activated the floating raft formation and started to break through the wall without any hesitation. This kind of situation made it very boring to watch a group of people arguing. They were half-hearted here, but the other side was very determined. 3 sects had already passed, so what could the remaining 4 sects do? Isolating the Sword Vein was already impossible. At most, they could split it, but what was the point? Thus, they sighed and lost interest in arguing. They returned to their respective rafts and prepared to break through the wall. Just as Taoist Blood River had said, since there was still a year, they would wait a little longer. Only the Blood River sect and the Soul Cultivator sect were still in communication, because they already felt that something was wrong. True Monarch Goyuan thought, "Senior brother, why do I feel that something is wrong? If we're going to follow the Sword Vein, shouldn't our 3 sects be the most in need? When did it become the beast-taming sect? When we just left the Heaven's Choice gravitational field and rushed into the universe in the direction of Zhou Xian, the beast-taming sect was the first to follow the Sword Vein. This caused a chain reaction. Now, it's the same again. The Imperial Beasts people didn't even discuss it with us, and just followed us with their hearts set on it. I don't believe that they didn't collude with the Sword Vein in private. So, the Sword Vein's trump card is the beast-taming sect?" True Monarch Jiao Shui was also feeling uneasy. "That's not all. There's also this Martial Saint Training Hall. After leaving Heaven's Choice, they were the third to follow, and they even used the cursor. What right do they have? Do they have the right to use the cursor? Our 3 sects have already decided to work together. Since when did the Martial Saint Training Hall represent our 3 sects? And this time, they even took the lead. They also didn't discuss it with us. What's going on? Do they think that they've found a powerful backer and don't care about their sects anymore?" Sigh, I was a little slow to react. Otherwise, you and I would have taken the lead. I want to see what the Sword Vein has up their sleeves. The two of them thought about it, but couldn't think of anything. They could only wait for the beast-taming sect to pass before it was their turn. Otherwise, the uneasiness in their hearts would grow stronger? Could it be that Heaven's Choice had already made its move? It shouldn't be that fast, right? As soon as the Sword Vein's floating raft emerged from the spatial passage, the swordsman's voice rang out in the cabin while they were still immersed in the vastness of the overworld and the starlight in the negative space. "Get out of the cabin and set up the formation. Prepare for battle." The swordsmen were confused. Battle? To whom? An ambush? Or was it the Martial Saint Training Hall outside? Thoughts were thoughts, doubts were doubts, but the instincts that had formed over the past 100 years still made them subconsciously jump out of the rafts and get into battle formation. Under the starry sky, no matter how far he tried to extend his divine sense, he still couldn't sense any enemies approaching. Only the floating raft in the Martial Saint Training Hall not far away was silently floating in the air, with no one coming out. Who was the opponent? This was everyone's question. Lu Xiaoyi's expression was cold. The second order revealed the mystery. Target. Next on the floating raft, Beast Tamer. There was only one rule: do not spread. The principle was to kill without mercy. No pursuit. You can make your own plans. The few perfected lords in charge quickly gathered together and began to nervously analyze and make arrangements. Fighting wasn't the problem. The problem was how to make use of the situation where the opponent had just come out of the space passage and had yet to gain a firm foothold, to achieve the greatest results with the least cost. This was just the appetizer. As for the reason, they had already thought of it. The sword master had said that these 6 families must have been set up by the great powers of Shangguan. Now, it seemed like it was these beasts who were playing with them. That's right, it didn't make sense that the closest thing to them was the beast tamer. It was completely unrelated. Lu Xiaoyi sent his divine sense to the floating raft in the Martial Saint training hall. Inside the raft, the hundreds of martial saints were all on guard. They also didn't know what the sword vein wanted to do. Was it targeting them? But they didn't dare to go out, afraid of causing misunderstandings. Lu Xiaoyi's communication came at the right time. Senior Brother Long, I have some things that I need to explain to you in advance. Long Xing stared blankly for a while, his heart filled with shock. Even though he had always boasted that he was unyielding and fearless in the Martial Saint training hall, in front of the infamous sword range, he was still not ferocious enough, not cold enough, not taking life seriously. Junior brother, if the evidence is conclusive, of course the Martial Saint training hall has nothing to say, Lu Xiaoyi said decisively. There's no evidence. And no time to find. Kill first. Senior brother can watch from the side. If you don't want to be stained with blood, there's no need to make a move. Long Jian struggled in his heart. He had never thought that as soon as he came out of the main world, there would be an internal battle. But he also understood that the meaning of being a gambler was to be resolute in placing bets. You can't be hesitant about whether to bet big or small. In the end, you won't get anything. Now, did the Martial Saint training hall still have the chance to sit on the fence? Gritting his teeth, he shouted, Everyone, get out of the raft! Sword vein, the first wave! We're the second wave! Our target is the Imperial Beast sect. Kill them all, don't leave any loose ends! The spatial tunnel gradually formed, and the Imperial Beast sect's floating raft slowly poked its head out of the spatial tunnel, followed by the cabin and the tail. Just before the entire raft was about to completely leave the spatial tunnel, the tens of millions of sword lights hanging in the air suddenly fell down. What would happen if cultivators attacked the floating raft? There wasn't an accurate answer. But under normal circumstances, the defense of the floating raft wasn't something that cultivators could easily break. The bigger the floating raft, the more and more defense formations it had. Therefore, the defense of a large floating raft was not something that small or medium-sized rafts could compare to. In theory, even if there were 100 or 200 cultivators attacking at the same time, they wouldn't be able to break through the hard shell of a large floating raft. But Zhou Fan, Song Rong and the others were extremely vicious. They sharply grasped the fatal weakness of the Imperial Beast sect's floating raft and attacked with all their might. The raft that Heaven's Choice Heavenly Empire had gifted them was originally old goods, and had been used for a long time. This kind of deterioration wasn't reflected in the strength of the outer shell, but in the propulsion system. The main defense of the floating raft was also the formation defense provided by the propulsion system, and not how hard the outer shell was. The outer shell was easy to replace, but the propulsion system was huge. In fact, these 7 families didn't spend much effort to repair it, and all of them had the attitude of using it whenever they could. Completely repairing it was already meaningless. These floating rafts were already barely able to propel themselves, and after breaking through and maintaining the spatial tunnel, there wasn't much left. They weren't like the new floating rafts, which could still maintain a relatively strong defense while breaking through the spatial tunnel. The swordsmen chose to attack when the Imperial Beast sect's floating raft was about to leave because they wanted to seize this opportunity. All of the floating raft's power was still used to maintain the spatial tunnel, and its formation defense was close to zero due to the lack of propulsion. The current floating raft was purely a large object, and it was completely exposed to the combined attacks of the swordsmen. The result was obvious. Most of the cultivators and their pet beasts were blown to pieces in midair. Chapter 1330. With one strike, 80% of the beast trainer sect was reduced to ashes. What followed was the frenzied killing of the swordsman group, Close to 300 swordsmen formed a net of swords, surrounding, dragging, and twisting. Only a few of the strongest essence soul-perfected cultivators who were covered in injuries charged out. What awaited them was the merciless killing of the swordsman-perfected cultivators. Long Jian and the other cultivators from the Martial Saint Training Hall felt their throats tighten and their mouths go dry. They knew very well that if they were in Long Jian's shoes, the result would be the same. There were no surprises. This was the difference between an army and a bandit, the difference between a professional and a semi-professional. They had completely lost the will to compete. Perhaps only such orthodoxies could set off monstrous waves in the universe, right? Just follow them. If you can't be the peak of the wave, you can be the bottom of the wave, but don't be the reef. Zhou Fan glared at Lu Xiaoyi fiercely. Lu Xiaoyi knew what he meant and waved his hand. No need to clean up the battlefield. Just leave it there. Since my sword vein has made a move, I'm not afraid of others knowing. The sword cultivators obeyed their orders as if they were only out to take a piss. After they were done, they didn't show off or linger around. Instead, they went back into the floating raft and disappeared. The entire process was done cleanly and without any sloppiness. The more it was like this, the more chilling it was. The eerie silence was suffocating. Wenji stayed in the Martial Saint Training Hall's floating raft and barely counted as half an envoy. He didn't make a sound. Long Jian didn't let him go. Elder Wen, you've really pushed a good fire pit for us. If they do this, they can wipe out the remaining sects in a few hours. Wenji didn't show any weakness. What's there to be afraid of? Moreover, if I didn't push you into the pit, wouldn't you jump into it yourself? Isn't it still a jump? Since you've jumped, you should stay put. Sooner or later, you'll get out of the pit. When that time comes, the universe will be peaceful, and you'll have the power in your hands. It's better than being a mouse in the universe. How many years have I been swallowing my anger? If this goes on, everyone's faith will become submissive. Long Jian sighed. Elder Wen, your mouth. Sigh, fine. I understand the logic. But isn't his sword vein a little too cruel? I feel really uneasy around them. I'm afraid that if I close my eyes and take a nap, I'll be swallowed by a tiger again. Wenji had no choice but to use his glib tongue to comfort him. It wasn't that he was willing to do so, but that he was forced to do so. Before he took action, he didn't know either. This bastard deserves to be hacked into 1,000 pieces. You guys, you still don't treat them as your own people. He needed to change his way of thinking, raise his awareness, and look at the problem from a higher perspective. When you get used to having them as your companions, I can guarantee that you will feel at ease even if you close your eyes for the rest of your life. With such companions around, what else do you have to worry about? Moreover, this was only a sword Dao giant, not a part of the main sect. To be able to reach such a level in heaven's selection, think about it, what would our sect be like? It had to be said that old Taoist Wenji was very good at studying people's hearts, and was even better at drawing pictures. He could draw some illusory and unrealistic things to life. But there was no other way. Once the matter of bluffing started, it would no longer be up to him. The spatial passage appeared once again. This time, it was the soul cultivator's floating raft. The cultivators of the Martial Saint Training Hall didn't pay attention to the formation of the spatial passage. Instead, they focused on the sword vein's floating raft. They were afraid that these swordsmen would go back on their word and attack again. Fortunately, the swordsmen kept their promise and didn't move an inch. When Go Yuan and his subordinates came out, they didn't even have time to appreciate the starry sky of the origin world. The first thing they saw was the wreckage of the floating raft and pieces of human corpses. The bloody stench of slaughter still lingered in the air, making it unforgettable. Go Yuan immediately contacted Long Jian. His intuition told him that this was a massacre committed by the swordsmen. He could tell from the smoothness of the edges of the floating raft that this wasn't something that could be done by magical techniques or fist energy. In an instant, he understood everything that had happened. Go Yuan was also a decisive person. He knew that he had to choose a side. It wasn't something that could be avoided by being vague. Thus, Lu Xiaoyi's divine sense said, "Before the 3 years are up, we soul cultivators are willing to stand together with the sword vein." This was a very straightforward expression. It meant that whether or not they could walk together in the end would depend on what kind of stage the sword vein provided for them. Soon after, Blood River, Pill Cultivator, and Body Vein arrived one by one. Their reactions were exactly the same as the soul cultivators. For the first time, Lu Xiaoyi appeared in front of everyone. His body was like a javelin, standing as straight as a pine tree. Throughout the entire process, he hadn't revealed a single word of truth since he was still in heaven's selection. He was using his actions to speak. From the moment he flew out of heaven's selection gravitational field, the sword vein's uniqueness, courage, and decisiveness in killing were displayed in front of everyone. All of this was more powerful than words. This might not be the orthodoxy of a sage, but it was definitely the most competent of combat orthodoxies. The sword vein had never revealed their goal, but along the way, everyone knew that they definitely had a goal, and a big one at that. Killing the beast control sect as a sacrifice to their flag was a reflection of the size of their goal. It was also an essential quality of an outstanding commander. One could say that he was cruel, but one couldn't deny his decisiveness. In a war, what kind of commander would you be willing to follow? The result didn't need to be said. He couldn't mention a specific goal, and he couldn't mention the method of marching. He couldn't mention it before, and he couldn't mention it now. Because in the void of the universe, as long as someone made a move, even if all 300 swordsmen went out, they still wouldn't be able to catch up. But now that the momentum had reached this point, it was time to separate sides. He didn't say it before because if he did, most people would leave because he was hiding something. But now that he said it, there was a possibility that they would follow. This was the result of him doing his best to rope in friends for the sword vein. How many he could rope in was up to fate. He raised a hand. Goal? Side? How do we go? I still won't say it. But from now on, if you follow the sword vein, you can't back out anymore. If you back out, the beast control sect will be the result. I've said a lot of nonsense, but you all know these things in your hearts. At the end of the day, it's a question of whether you dare to take the risk. If you dare to take the risk, follow. If you don't, please do as you please. This isn't an interstellar journey, but a journey of death, a journey of battle, and a journey of rebirth. No one can promise you anything, no one can guarantee you anything, and no one can protect you anything. Under the dome of heaven, there's no competition. The sword vein doesn't walk with cowards. If you follow, you must obey my orders. This is my answer. Now, those who are willing to fight with the sword vein, step forward. There was no other way. It was that difficult to rope in people without revealing his true intentions. He couldn't reveal Taiposhi's ultimate move when he wasn't sure. So before he went, he had to have the determination to follow. This was the reason why he took off his pants to vent and tried to cover it up. He couldn't let Heaven's Chosen know where they were going. Chapter 1331. To Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, the first to step forward was actually the Body Cultivator Alliance. That physique meridian that had always been hesitant and unwilling, always admiring itself and thinking highly of itself. Although he knew a little about the history between them and the beast-controlling sect, he didn't expect them to be the most straightforward. A body cultivator true monarch was very straightforward. Our physique vein has always regarded the sword vein as our own, because we have the same code of conduct. Unfortunately, the Heaven's Choice physique vein's orthodoxy has already been assimilated by Taoism. We're just the most stubborn of them all. We've always resisted because we didn't know your capabilities. Since it's like this, no matter which sword vein orthodoxy you're from, our Chonggu physique vein is willing to accompany you. Life and death are up to the heavens. Rather than be worn down to death, why not throw ourselves in? If you can destroy the beast-controlling sect without reason, Our physique vein will support you. The Martial Saint Training Hall stood out almost at the same time. This was the benefit of having a spy. Although they couldn't say what they believed in, it was very obvious that the Martial Saint Training Hall had already abandoned the small circle of the three families, and had become the loyal dogs of the Sword Range. Next was Blood River. The soul cultivators also didn't hesitate. In their hearts, this was the best choice. If this swordsman team really had that Sword Dao juggernaut behind them, then needless to say, everyone would be happy. Everyone would be motivated to fight. Even if they were thousands of miles away, they would know who they were fighting for, and there would always be hope. If this was just an ordinary sword vein, because of the Sword Master's extraordinariness, they would at least have superhuman fighting ability. No matter where they went, with the Sword Master's ability, they wouldn't be at a disadvantage. The worst thing was that they acted alone. That meant that they couldn't do anything, because they were betraying the strongest power in this universe. On the floating raft, the swordsmen true monarchs were surging with emotions. The Sword Master was truly extraordinary. He didn't say anything at the end, and instead, everyone came to join him? This speed was much faster than they had imagined. They thought they would have to waste a lot of time. Zhou Fan snorted. Humph! I knew it. The Sword Master said before he went out that whoever doesn't comply after a moment, he'll kill them. Looks like there's no chance. Look at those alchemists, didn't they also stand out? It took less than 10 breaths of time. How did the Sword Master do it? They vaguely felt that it was a kind of accumulation of power. It had started from Lu Hai, to rejecting the Blood River and rejecting the Blood River, Heaven's Choice's decision, and the bloody massacre in the main world. If these peoples didn't have the courage to fall out with the Sword Base, and the Sword Dao, they're to be's. The path of power wasn't just limited to battle. The pill cultivator's primordial spirit ancient cauldron cupped his hands together. Sword Master's heroic spirit is something that I have never seen before in my life. Dao Dao sect s heavens Dao heavens Dao s. Sword sect s's, sect s. I wonder if the Sword Lord will allow us to leave? Lu Xiaoyi didn't bat an eyelid. My sword vein has never forced anyone to do anything they don't want to do. It's up to you whether you want to leave or stay. Senior Marshal Brother, you can do as you please. There are many things to do, so I won't stay any longer. Almost at the same time, the leaders of the physique lineage, Martial Saint Dojo, Blood River, and Soul Cultivators all transmitted their divine senses. Sword Master, should we surround and kill him? Lu Xiaoyi was surprised. This was just the last test. Did they want to know if he was a thug who didn't care about right and wrong? Or was he a cold-blooded swordsman who clearly distinguished between gratitude and grudges? Of course, he wouldn't have any killing intent towards this group of alchemists. Since they had spoken first, and since they dared to openly propose leaving, why should he stop them? This was the reason why he had been unwilling to reveal his true identity and true purpose. The sword vein is not Zerg. You're all overthinking it. After rejecting these troublesome fellows, Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand at Gu Dingzi. Only then did Gu Dingzi's hanging heart settle down. This sword lunatic really didn't have good intentions. Not to mention that he had the help of the other 4 families. Just the sword vein alone was enough to deal with them all cleanly. After roaming the universe for thousands of years, he had long seen through the right and wrong of human nature. He was also well aware of the ominous glint in the eyes of the 4 families. In Lu Xiaoyi's opinion, this was them testing whether the sword vein was murderous or not. In his opinion, these fellows wanted to kill him and steal his pills as a final preparation for the big battle. Not only would they silence him, but they would also increase their family's wealth. It was the best of both worlds. Fortunately, he was now very inclined to believe that the sword vein was a branch of the giant sword Dao. Although it wasn't enough to change the neutral stance of the alchemists, at least he could raise the stakes once more. With a wave of his hand, a cultivator below handed over a pill cauldron space. This was a storage space exclusive to alchemists. pills could be stored for a long time without their medicinal effects fading. There are a lot of pills and great medicines here. It's still the same old rules. We'll take them on credit. I'll let Sword Master know that the universe's cultivation isn't just black and white. There will always be some people and some orthodoxies. Even if they don't stand on your side, their existence is still beneficial to you. Yu Gao, Zhou Chang, and I will wait here for Sword Master to return victorious. The alchemist's floating raft slowly left. This was the cultivation world, this was humanity. This was an intelligent life form. You would never be able to gather everyone to your side, even if you were a Xianyuan swordsman. Lu Xiaoyi faintly smiled. This roping in could be considered perfect. Of the 7 families, he had gathered 5. Destroying one and letting go of the other was in accordance with the rules of the heavenly Tao. He clasped his hands towards the crowd. In the next few months, we will see the results. The Sword Vein's floating raft was the first to leave. The remaining 4 followed closely behind. The outcome had been decided, and the stakes had been placed. Now, all that was left was to reveal the pot. In the void of the origin world, the starry sky was still the same, but there were far fewer human cultivators. Before the storm, even ordinary beasts knew to hide and move, let alone humans. At this time, in the cultivation world of the origin world, those who returned would not come out again. They needed to stay in their sects to deal with the great changes. Those who had not returned were all hurrying back to their sects to contribute to the domain. How many years had it been since such a situation had occurred in the dozens of universes near Zhou? Tens of thousands of years? Hundreds of thousands of years? Even the void beasts understood and fled from this possible bloody battlefield. In such an external environment, these heavens-chosen cultivators were not in the mood to admire the vast universe that was completely different from the negative space. The only thing they cared about now was where exactly were they flying to. Were they going to keep flying like this? If so, they wouldn't be able to fly far. Furthermore, their current direction was not in the direction of Zhou. Were they going to set their target on another domain near Zhou? It seemed like this was a bit anticlimactic. It didn't conform to the mysterious situation created by the Sword Vein? Or should they find another place to escape into the negative space? Then, what was the meaning of coming out of the origin world this time? No one knew, including the swordsmen. As they flew like this, the curiosity in their hearts grew stronger until a meteorite appeared in front of them. At the same time, Lu Xiaoyi's divine sense rushed towards every floating raft and shouted, "Crash into it! Those who disobey will be killed." Chapter 1332. Using a floating raft to crash into a meteorite? Only idiots. One was hollow while the other was solid. There was no comparison. But they still crashed into it without hesitation. Because when they approached the meteorite, they already felt that it was different. It was as if it was not a meteorite, but a passage. Just like how there was no innate Tao tablet in the main world, there was no innate spiritual treasure in the reverse space. So most of them did not have a direct understanding of this. First, it was indeed unfamiliar. Second, it was too short for them to think, discuss, or weigh the pros and cons. Since it was not a real meteorite, then it must be the Sword Master's secret passage? Here, they had no other way out. Besides crashing into it, what else could they do? 5 floating rafts crashed into it one by one. Marshall Saint Training Hall, Body Vein Alliance, Blood River Sect, Soul Cultivators, and finally the Sword Vein floating raft. Many large floating rafts crashed into it, but the meteorite did not move at all. There was no collision or abnormality. It was as if nothing had happened. In the meteorite space, in the unfamiliar environment, the cultivators all came out of their cabins. Only now did they vaguely understand where this place was. It was not a space passage, but the interior of some innate spiritual treasure. They were curious, but they were even more curious about the purpose of coming here. Lu Xiaoyi let out a long breath. Finally, he brought them in. How could they leave without his permission? Originally, he could have explained it to everyone. But because there was still one more batch, he was too lazy to say it twice. So he remained silent. This made the group anxious. They were trapped in the space and could not leave. When they asked him, he only said one sentence, waiting for someone. However, this also raised everyone's expectations once again. They were still not all of them? Then, what was this sword master up to? 1 month's time was like sitting on pins and needles. Just like training eagles, he had to properly polish these people's temperaments. Only then would they be able to command them freely in future battles. He also wanted to take advantage of this period of time to properly assess the strength of these people. The 5 orthodoxies added together had a total of 191 true monarchs. Among them, 32 true monarchs were the strongest. There were also 800 Yuanying. These people seemed to have surpassed the number of Xian Yuan sword sect when he left. Of course, the quality was incomparable. Moreover, the Great Tao had opened up, and nearly half of these people had come up because of the Great Tao. Numbers alone didn't mean anything. Perhaps the ones who were truly useful were the sword soldier army, and the other group of fighters that had yet to arrive. It would be best if an army was made up entirely of elite soldiers, but that was not realistic. Therefore, the best combination was to have a small number of elite soldiers and a large number of miscellaneous soldiers. Elites could often play a decisive role in a battle, but the existence of miscellaneous soldiers could not be underestimated. Without their sacrifice and support, an army would not be complete. No matter how elite they were, there would be a day when they would be exhausted. Apart from Lu Xiaoyi, no one else could enter or leave this space. He had already been gone for half a month, causing everyone to feel as if they had lost their backbone. To be able to increase one's usefulness to such a degree was not something an ordinary person could do, and it was not entirely because of the orthodoxy behind him. A month later, the space faintly trembled as a new intruder barged in, causing every human's hair to stand on end. Immemorial beast. Primordial fierce beast. A total of 300 primordial fierce beasts, all with the cultivation of a true monarch. Just from the ferocious aura that filled the sky, one could tell that they were not ordinary characters. To the majority of the Heaven's Choice cultivators present, the primordial fierce beasts were not unfamiliar to them. These fierce beasts were also the other masters of the Heaven's Choice continent. A total of 300 true monarch-level beasts. This was already close to half of the primordial fierce beast's strength, right? And looking at their aura, almost all of them were high-level true monarchs, similar to the existence of a human's yang spirit. At this point, everyone understood that they had gotten themselves into big trouble. It was impossible for them to go into the universe silently to fight guerrilla warfare. This level of strength could only be used on the main battlefield. But they didn't know, was it Zhou Xian? Or was it far away? It's far away! Lu Xiaoyi was in high spirits. His hundreds of years of hard work was all for this time to return home in glory. He did it, and he did it exceptionally well. With a wave of his hand, in front of the hundreds of true monarchs, humans, and primordial fierce beasts, as well as close to 2,000 Yuanying, a vast galaxy appeared. There was no standard, only 3 bright spots that were particularly eye-catching. Lu Xiaoyi pointed. 3 battlefields. Zhou Xian, 5th ring, clear sky. I won't say why, you have all been asking about these things for hundreds of years. Although no one said it clearly, it is actually very clear that this is the beginning of the universe's great change. It is also where the universe's change lies. The human cultivators were very excited. They had come to the right place. If they wanted to gamble, they had to gamble big. Only by participating in the flow of the general trend could one truly change one's fate. If you went to a remote starfield to cause trouble, who would pay attention? Half immortals wouldn't pay attention. Immortal Court wouldn't care. Heavenly Tao wouldn't care. Then what was the meaning of your efforts? Their current strength might not be enough to be the main force of these 3 battlefields. but as an important auxiliary force, it was more than enough. Where was it? Lu Xiaoyu revealed the riddle. It's not Zhou Xian. Because this is destined to be a long war, it is not suitable for a team like us to intervene too early. Otherwise, we can only waste our time in vain. It's not fifth ring. Because the strength of fifth ring is above Zhou Xian. With my sect here, no one can overturn the heavens there. All the participants finally felt relieved. Although they had already guessed it, this was the first time that the Sword Master had personally admitted it. There was no doubt that they would stand on the side of the orthodoxy that pushed down the great Tao domino. They were the gravediggers of the old universe, and they could also be the pioneers of the new era. What other reason could make them fight to the death more than this? He smashed his fist heavily towards the green light spot. Our goal is clear sky. Because this is the hometown of the 13th ancestor of the Xianyuan sword sect, who was once a Zenith Heaven Sword Immortal. It is also the starting point of this reshuffling of the universe, and it is also the place that the opponent must take down no matter what. Our goal is to protect it. Victory in clear sky. Then expand our victory to the entire universe. The human cultivators below began to roar, and the primordial beasts let out mountain collapsing roars. They were the kind of existences that had been abandoned by those with vested interests. Now, it was time for them to change their old faces and sing for the orthodoxy. Lu Xiaoyu shouted sternly. You might not know. This is also a gamble. Because too many people have bet Xuanyuan's fate on the fifth ring. So no matter which side, they will all gather their forces in the fifth ring. But I think that clear sky is also indispensable. Because of this, we may not be the auxiliary force in clear sky, but the main force. What does this mean? You know very well in your hearts. Huge casualties, isolation, and a life and death situation. What I want to tell you is that once you get on my ship, don't even think about getting off. Otherwise, don't blame my sword for being merciless. Chapter 1333. Taiposhi began to move, moving at a speed that humans and primordial beasts couldn't understand. It was just a feeling, fast. This was the highest achievement of the cultivation system under the Heavenly Eye system. Not only did it have the positive and negative space movement, but it also had the spiritual treasure system's ultra-long-distance teleportation. Only when all these were combined together could it become possible to return to the blue sky. Leaving these people and beasts to savor the meaning of the future, Lu Xiaoyu arrived at the group of primordial beasts. The leaders of the various large tribes were all there. Lu Xiaoyu was a little curious. Lord Lu, the number of primordial beasts that came this time is more than I expected. And they are all top fighters. Heaven's choice doesn't have much power left, right? Aren't you worried at all? Xiang Lu's dead fish eyes bulged. Worried about what? Heaven's choice humans aren't worried. You Xianyuan aren't worried either. Then what do we primordial beasts have to worry about? In terms of craziness, we primordial beasts aren't any weaker than you human swordsmen. That's right, don't look at how only 300 primordial beasts came. Our selection criteria is based on strength from top to bottom. So those standing here are 90% of the primordial beast's strength, excluding half immortals. We have the courage to take a gamble. You have also given us the confidence to take a gamble. If we take out half and leave half behind, we might as well not come out at all. Bashi smiled. Our consideration is that this trip to the origin world has a high probability of encountering primordial sacred beasts. No matter if we are in the same camp or not, we have to do our best. So we can't hide anything and have to go all out. Otherwise, it would be a waste to be passive and get beaten up. Lu Xiaoyu nodded. His consideration was very thorough, and it was also the truth. This was a mission that decided the future of a tribe. If you were still overcautious, it would be no different from courting death. Jiuing also said, Heaven's choice has nothing to worry about. The human Taoists and Buddhists have both made a Tao oath and informed us to do our best to ensure the safety of the Heaven's Choice continent. So in recent years, even if the origin world is locked in a fierce battle, the Heaven's Choice continent is a rare stable rear. I don't dare to say the future, but before the outcome is decided, nothing will happen. Victory, nothing needs to be said. Defeat, nothing needs to be said. So, what else is there to say? Lu Xiaoyu was very interested in the direction of Heaven's Choice because he still didn't know the true direction of Heaven's Choice. Other than knowing that Taoism and Buddhism had parted ways, he was confused about everything else. You guys came out a bit later. Are there any special changes in the Heaven's Choice continent? Xiang Lu pondered and said, Not much has changed. We set off 3 months later than you. Before we left, we had inquired everywhere. The high-level plan is still a taboo. Only the big countries have formed cliques. The small and medium forces have already reached a white-hot point. If it weren't for the restriction of the oath, I'm afraid that people's brains would have already turned into beasts' brains. There were basically 3 factions, the Taoist progressive faction, the Buddhist progressive faction, and the conservative faction. In terms of numbers, the left-behind faction still accounted for more than half of them. However, if we were to consider the quality of the troops, the majority of the elite forces of the upper nation would be mobilized. Thus, in reality, the Heaven's Chosen cultivators would be mobilizing 70% to 80% of their strength. They cannot be underestimated. Lu Xiaoyu was very humble. After all, the immemorial beasts were the natives of the Heaven's Choice continent. Moreover, they were the other masters of the Heaven's Choice continent. The level of contact they had was much higher than the few humans who were not loved by their parents. In your opinion, what is the main goal of the Heaven's Choice continent? Xiang Lu was a bit hesitant and unsure. However, he still decided to speak the truth. Right now, everyone was on the same boat. And on the same rock. Any concealment could lead to consequences. Moreover, this human was the leader. Here, he was already the leader. Now that they were in Xuanyuan's territory, it was needless to say. We have always been in contact with the human sun god. This is also to ensure that both sides can maintain a balanced framework. They aren't willing to reveal anything, but we have eyes, ears, and instincts. We can still roughly sense something. Bashi, you have a glib tongue. Tell us. Bashi was in existence akin to a military advisor among the immemorial beasts. Reality had proven that even though they were both snakes, a snake with 9 heads was not as useful as a snake with 1 head. In our opinion, there are only a few possibilities. Heaven's Choice Taoist and Buddhist faction will both choose to attack the 5th ring, or both of them will attack Shou Xian, or one of them will attack the 5 rings and one of them will attack Shou Xian. There is a principle that Master needs to understand. Heaven's Choice Taoism and Buddhism are both part of the Heaven's Choice continent in the negative space. However, in the main world, they are enemies who can't wait to kill each other. Judging from this, it is unlikely that one of them will attack the 5 rings and one of them will attack Shou Xian. Because the 5 rings are too far away, the attacking side will have to move out tens or hundreds of years in advance. It won't be as close as Shou Xian. Then, who will be willing to leave first? Leaving the other side to manage the Heaven's Choice continent, and snatch away what used to be their territory and influence? Therefore, being on guard against each other is the key. In other words, they will leave at the same time. No one can think of exerting influence on the Heaven's Choice continent alone. Lu Xiaoyu praised. Careful. After listening to your words, I've been enlightened. None of the people who came to the Tai-Pu realm were stupid. They were all bewitched by him. They were all true monarchs of Yuanying. In terms of reading, even the saints of the human world couldn't compare. What kind of conspiracy could they not understand? To be able to come here, the most important thing was still their own interests. And he, Lu Xiaoyu, had made full use of this point to create the current situation. He was very clear that other than the swordsman, this was definitely not his own cultivator army, nor was it Xuanyuan's external army. They were him. The Blood River, the Soul Cultivators, the Martial Saint Training Hall, the ancient physique bloodline, and the immemorial beasts. They had only come together for a common goal. If this goal didn't exist in the future, how could Lu Xiaoyi's charm really affect them? Their personal friendship was definitely there, but to have them help you with something, that was just a fool's dream. She smiled slightly and said somewhat malevolently, "Since we came together, then there can only be one goal. Either the 5 rings, or Zhou Xian. We won't consider anything else but the most practical thing. Marching. The so-called general trend, the so-called nodes, the so-called realm defense, the heaven and earth great membrane chessboard, these can all be overcome. But there is one thing in the universe that is the hardest to overcome, and that is the ultra-long distance march of an army. So we believe that the goal of the Heaven's Choice faction can only be Zhou Xian. There can't be any other choice." Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. From the looks of it, Zhou Xian is under a lot of pressure. Who knows if he can hold on until the moment the reinforcements arrive? Shi sharply countered with a question. From what we found out later, the exalted master didn't come from the upper realm. He came from Xianyuan, the swordsman who wandered Zhou Xian for hundreds of years. Then we want to know, why did you give up on helping Zhou Xian, who helped you to become a nascent soul monarch? Instead, you went back to save Qin Kong, who only had a possibility of being in danger? Is it because the homeland will always be first? Or are there other reasons? Chapter 1334. Lu Xiaoyi said word by word. "First of all, Blue Sky is not my hometown. Neither is Fifth Ring. My hometown is meaningless in the grand scheme of the universe. That's the Crow ancestors' hometown, and that's the most important thing." Lu Xiaoyi glanced at the immemorial beasts. "I won't decide based on whether it's my hometown or not. In fact, Fifth Ring, Blue Sky, and Zhou Xian are half of my hometown. What I need to determine is which is the source of this war. Zhou Xian, isn't it? That's because the power of heaven's selection is too strong. This is a war that's destined to last for a long time. It's best to drag it out, not to end it quickly. That's why I won't go. With the chessboard of heaven and earth, this game can still be played." The immemorial beasts nodded in agreement. What was the limit of Zhou Xian's chessboard of heaven and earth? This was a mystery, and also the biggest reliance of the people of Zhou Xian. They only knew that it had already merged with the 3,000 continents of Zhou Xian, and its fate was connected. It was unfathomable. If the swordsman went there, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Maybe Fifth Ring is, maybe not. But the problem is that with my powerful sect there, I can't play a decisive role. But Blue Sky is different. The defense there is weak, and the people of Fifth Ring have always thought that the karma there is in Fifth Ring, because they've been doing things in the name of Fifth Ring for more than 10,000 years. And Blue Sky is just the former residence of 2 of Fifth Ring's great sects. Speaking of hometowns, there are many Fifth Ring's hometowns. There's the Left Ring system, the Gemini constellation, the Great Thousand Corridor, and so on. Blue Sky is Xuanyuan's hometown, the 3 Pure Ones' hometown, and not the Fifth Ring's hometown. There's a difference. So even if Xianyuan and the 3 Pure Ones sent people back to help, their strength is limited. This is why I have to go back. I'm a person who knows my own limits. I'll only fill in the gaps and do what's within my ability." Shi nodded. "Master, you're saying that the source of the general trend still lies with the Crow ancestor? This is related to the direction of the general trend of the war? The 5 Ring people didn't think that Azure Sky was the source of providence, but they thought that the 5 Ring people were. However, Heaven's Choice's side might be interested in Qin Kong, because they might not be able to take down the 5th Ring, so why not split up their forces and take down Qin Kong first? Is that what you mean?" Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This military advisor was very smart. "Therefore, it doesn't matter if I'm there or not. But Qin Kong definitely needs me, so I formed this team." Xiang Lu interrupted. "What if no one goes?" Lu Xiaoyi shrugged and said irresponsibly. "Then let's kill our way to the 5th Ring." Shi said. "One last question. If Heaven's Choice Taoist and Buddhist sects really set their sights on Zhou Xian, what power do you think can offend the fifth ring? At the same time, he also has the ability to bring Qin Kong along? Lu Xiaoyi pushed the blame away. I don't know. I only act based on my feelings. I always felt that Heaven's Choice had allies, but they were hidden very deeply. They won't show their faces until the war starts. Xian Lu sighed. For the sake of your intuition, you pulled so many friends to a place where there might or might not be a war? What's more, they're separated by a super long distance. Using the spirit treasure transmission system? Master, you're really selfless. Lu Xiaoyi didn't feel embarrassed at all. Friends, shouldn't we help each other? If there's no war, let's just take it as a trip. When we go to Qin Kong, I'll entertain everyone. This person's shamelessness hurt the primordial beasts. They had found the right person to help, but the place to help was a little unreliable. Just as they were about to end the conversation, Jiao Ying suddenly thought of a question. Master, that time in the bamboo forest, when you were lying on the bamboo bed, how much spiritium were you trying to extort? Lu Xiaoyi said righteously. What extortion? That's too unpleasant. You guys didn't give me a single strand, so how could I not say anything? It was just a joke. And how much? It should be 200,000 strands. Your comprehension ability is too poor, and you even gave me a discount. The primordial beasts were a little depressed, but there was nothing they could do. Khanate spirit treasures wouldn't listen to them. They didn't know why this person was so shameless, but why were there so many people helping him? Lu Shi didn't feel that he was wrong at all. He pointed at one of the primordial beasts and shouted, Fat cattle! Move your ass away so I can see what's hiding behind it. Fat Cattle laughed dryly and moved his body, revealing something behind him. He smiled awkwardly at Lu Xiaoyi. Little Meow greets senior brother. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Didn't I tell you not to come? This is a war, not a sightseeing tour. Little Meow's voice was very soft but firm. Little Meow feels that this experience is very important to me, so... Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Little Meow was also a cultivator. He couldn't decide all of its actions. Since it was here, how could he chase it away? As Taiposhi traveled through the universe, everyone slowly calmed down. Since everything was clear, the most important thing now was to use their own abilities. Even if the numinous treasure system saved people, it would still take a long time. They didn't dare to say much, but it would take at least a few decades. They just didn't know if they could make it in time. When everyone quieted down, old Taoist Wenji came over. My young friend, I support your judgment. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Why? Just because I have faith too. So no matter what I do, you will support me? Old Taoist Wenji smiled. That's right. This isn't blind obedience. It's because we believe in the orthodoxy. We instinctively have the ability to see through the essence of things. Our vision is different from theirs and is more independent of the outside world. As the saying goes, the onlooker sees more clearly. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head and sighed. I'm not an onlooker. I'm the person involved. Old Taoist Wenji said mysteriously. I know what you're thinking. What are you worried about? What are you confused about? This old Taoist can help you resolve your doubts. But you have to promise me that in the future, I will automatically have the right to spread my faith in the fifth ring. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. It's useless for me to promise you. Don't look at how impressive I look now. In the fifth ring, I'm nothing. There's a bunch of elders above me. Even in the blue sky, I can't make the decision. Wenji didn't care. It doesn't matter. I just need you to promise me. Because sooner or later, your voice will be the voice of the blue sky 5 rings. I firmly believe that. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. If you preach like this, there's really not much meaning. Alright, I'll promise you. But you can't go overboard. Old Taoist Wenji smiled very happily. Very good, it's a deal. My young friend, I guess what you want to know the most now is when the natural selection gang will make their move, right? In theory, The best time to attack should be at Zhou Xian, the 5th ring, and the blue sky 5 rings at the same time. This way, they won't be able to warn and support each other. Am I right? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This old Taoist Wenji was indeed very knowledgeable. He pointed out what he was thinking with one sentence. That's right. Then, how can they agree on a time? I don't think I've heard of a method of communication that can help two places hundreds of kilometers away instantly synchronize? Old Taoist Wenji said softly. When the next Xiantian Dao collapses, that's the moment when the universe is in chaos. There were countless insect swarms in the universe. With such a long time to dispatch, it shouldn't be difficult to gather a few large insect swarms. They're also proficient in the ability to reverse space, and their numbers are huge. It's much more convenient for them to deal with the 5 rings or blue skies than for heaven's chosen to travel thousands of miles. Hearing this, he asked, "Little friend, don't keep everything to yourself. Looking at your actions, you spent so much effort to gather an army that can be considered to have some strength in the universe. It definitely wasn't for your so-called what if. If there wasn't a direct threat, you wouldn't have taken such a big step." Lu Xiaoyi sighed and pointed to the ancient beasts in the distance. "Do you see them?" Wenji was puzzled. "Them? What do you mean?" Lu Shi's eyes were deep. Heaven's chosen ancient beasts are only a part of the ancient beasts in the entire universe. And it's a part of the weaker ones. Among the ancient beasts, there is a group that has always been in the main world. We call them the ancient sacred beasts. Wenji was very surprised. As far as I know, the relationship between the ancient sacred beasts and the humans of the main world is quite good. Even if it's been too long and there are occasional bumps, they obtained the right to live in the main world because they protect the orthodoxy of the main world. It's unlikely that they would help reverse space and go against the main world, right? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. What does it have to do with the relationship between which side you're on? It's only about benefits. The reboot of the universe, the change of eras, everything has to start from the beginning. To the ancient beasts, it's a chance to rise again. But to the ancient sacred beasts, who have vested interests, it's a challenge to their authority. It's shaking the life they've been used to for millions of years. Would they be indifferent to such a change? Would they rejoice? Would they surrender without a fight? How is that possible? It's the same thing, but the situation is different, so what you see is different. Therefore, the ancient beasts will not hesitate to stand on our side. Similarly, the ancient sacred beasts will be more inclined to oppose, especially in a situation where someone is bewitching them. Wenji sighed. In the ancient records of my belief path, it vaguely mentioned that your crow ancestors have deep ties with the ancient sacred beasts. Will they betray you? Lu Xiaoyi sneered. There's one thing you have to understand. Even if it's an immortal, the past is the past. Now is our era. So don't use the relationship from 10,000 years ago to define the relationship now. Everything will change. Only benefits and the survival of the race will not change. To me, those who follow me will prosper, those who oppose me will die. Get close to me, you're a sacred beast. Stay away from me, you're a beast. I don't care who you are. What a disgrace! Wenji shook his head. This Xuanyuan's orthodoxy was truly vicious. King learned his ability from his sword Dao Steel, and then you turned around and refused to admit it. As if knowing what he was thinking, Lu Shi's gaze was firm. The crow ancestor's biggest problem is that he dug a hole and didn't fill it. You caused a lot of shit, and after pushing away morality, you don't care anymore? It's so tiring that we juniors don't have to do anything else in our lives, just wipe our butts. The crow ancestor's only concern is Xianyuan. So, as long as I take care of Xianyuan, I don't care about anything else. Wenji was really curious. What was this freak's belief? But such a question couldn't be asked. He only looked at the ancient beasts. If that's the case, they're in trouble. Lu Xiao smiled. Don't worry about them. They're willing to do this. Do you think they're stupid? They're smart. Look at these 300 big beasts. They're the top 300 ancient beasts in terms of combat strength. They're almost all of their strength. Why? They came out to fight with the sacred beasts. So they didn't bring yawning beasts, so they didn't bring the weak with weak strength. They're too clear about their situation. Although they look a little ugly, they're quite smart. They know when to fight with their lives on the line and when to be a coward. A very smart group. Wen Ji stared at him. Little friend, if that day really comes, humans shouldn't participate in the ancient beasts conflict. This isn't good for you. I think you won't be able to hold back. Lu Xiaoyi was disdainful. What you've heard is a rumor from the ancient times, right? The ancient sacred beasts displayed their might and drove the beasts into the negative space. Do you really believe this? Without the help of humans back then, it's not certain who's the sacred beasts and who's the beasts now. Don't worry, I won't use Xuanyuan's overall strength. However, individual strength was still possible. Could it be that I could just watch as the side that supported me was destroyed just like that? Even if I don't do it, I have to give the sacred beasts some laxatives first. History is written by the victors. How do you write it? You're more clear than me. Chapter 1336. Taiposhi was advancing in a way that none of the cultivators could understand. Constantly entering and exiting the positive and negative space, constantly using spiritual treasures to teleport. A series of messy operations. Lu Xiaoyi, who had some understanding of the route, had long lost his sense of direction. Later, he was too lazy to observe, he could just fly however he wanted. What was there to worry about? While he was in the Taipu realm, he did not have nothing to do. As the commander of the army, he had the right to ask the various organizations to be honest with each other about their strength, tactics, and specialties. These things could be used in a large army battle and could not be ignored. Fortunately, everyone understood what they were about to encounter. For their lives, no one resisted. Relatively speaking, the cooperation between the human orthodoxies was still relatively easy, because humans were originally a race that was good at working together. Under Lu Xiaoyi's coordination, Taipu realm formed a bustling atmosphere of military training. Immemorial beasts were a bit worse, but it all depended on people. This was a journey filled with anxiety, because he had to constantly pray that the great Tao would shatter a little later, so that he could safely reach blue sky and send a warning to the fifth ring. Lu Xiaoyi thought that he was infallible, but he thought too much. The powerful and experienced fifth ring did not need his warning. The fifth ring was already in the midst of preparing for the big battle. Since 100 years ago, they had already begun to recall the cultivators who went out, and no longer continued their endless plundering. They gathered their strength and waited for the war. To the fifth ring, this was a very sullen, very abnormal war. Attacking had long been integrated into their blood, but the problem now was, where was the enemy? The only place they could be sure of was the Heaven's Choice continent. But this place was not a place where the cultivator army could go. It was too long, too slow, and it could easily cause the Heaven's Choice to unite against a common enemy. The gains did not make up for the losses. Zhou was also a relatively certain main battlefield, but for the same reason, the super long distance made their long distance attacks meaningless. They could not effectively form an effective encirclement against the Heaven's Choice people in Zhou. Moreover, if they left, what would happen to their home? This kind of long-distance attack would take at least a few hundred years. If the fifth ring was lost, you would not be able to come back. Therefore, in their long habit of taking the initiative to plunder, they welcomed this time's unaccustomed passive waiting. Just like Lu Xiaoyi, the fifth ring people knew that their opponent might not be the Heaven's Chosen One, because the Heaven's Chosen One had the same scruples as them. But who was their opponent? He had a guess, but he couldn't be sure. In the Primal Cave's Thunder Palace, a few sword young gods were having a discussion. Originally, communication between them was just a matter of using their divine senses, and there was no need for them to gather together. However, they were about to face the biggest challenge in the past 10,000 years. There were many things that they could understand each other better if they met in person. The inner sword Guandu, Jizhong, Heku, the outer sword Gongyao, Guangbua, and Shangting. Except for the one floating outside to monitor Tianzi, the rest were all here. This was also the first time in thousands of years that all the yang spirits of Xianyuan had gathered together. Because for such a major event, how could the yang spirit not sense it? They didn't need anyone to tell them to hurry back to their sect. This was their responsibility. Heku frowned. I'm sure that Zerg will be one of the attackers. This can be seen from some clues. I've been wandering in the outer space for hundreds of years and occasionally found something, but I've never been able to grasp the real thing, nor can I determine the scale or location. From the news from Supreme and the three Pure Ones, they also suspect that there should be more than one big insect swarm. 4 to 500 years ago, we once wiped out a big insect swarm. It should have been one of the first groups to move here, but it wasn't a secret and we discovered it. After that, Zerg's movements were even more careful and he never disappeared, but I'm sure that they must be hiding somewhere, waiting for an opportunity. Shangting also said. The three Pure Ones and Supreme believe that there will be Buddhist forces joining in. This doesn't only include the realms that we've plundered. For Buddhists, this is a battle of orthodoxy, and they don't need a reason. However, the universe is vast, and there are countless Buddhist forces in the hundreds of universes around the fifth ring. Time is limited, and we don't have the time to deal with them one by one. Jizhong pondered. We've already plowed through those realms that have a grudge with us in the past 100 years, so there shouldn't be much left. However, I still think that this isn't all. There are too many races in the universe, and there are also many great powers and realms. It's hard to distinguish. What I mean is, we still need to strengthen the fifth ring's power. This is our foundation. We don't have a macro membrane, so we have to drag them out and fight. Zerg is boundless, and once he falls into the realms, the damage to the mortal world is too great. We can't bear it. Gong Yao was a bit hesitant. All the big and small sects in the fifth ring are transferring people here from their hometowns. Under the threat of Zerg's numbers, every yuanying is precious. This is different from a surprise attack by elites. However, Xuanyuan's problem is, should we transfer people from Clear Sky? Unlike the Gemini Thousand Galaxies, Clear Sky is also the Crow ancestors' homeworld. What are the chances of them attacking Clear Sky? The other fifth ring powers don't have to consider this, but we have to. Can we have the best of both worlds, taking care of both sides? Or should we give up on one? Uncle Guang shook his head and sighed. It's not about whether we give up or not. It's that the three Pure Ones have already given up. Tai and the other sects have mostly left, and if we insist on defending Clear Sky, it's meaningless for us to send a small number of cultivators back. We have to send all of them back. Also, there's another factor we have to consider. How should we deal with the Great Mercy Temple on Fangjiang Island? If we keep them, they might be a hidden danger, but if we don't keep them, we have to eliminate them first. It's too late to do this now, and it's easy to cause instability within Clear Sky. What they were discussing was the issue of choosing Qing Kong. Because of various uncertainties, it was difficult to make a suitable choice. The enemy was unknown. The number was unknown. The strength was unknown. If you put too much strength into it, it's easy to waste it. When the fifth ring is the main defense target, the consequences of scattering your forces are very serious. If you put too little strength into it, then you might as well not put it in. Wouldn't you be sending people to their deaths? This was the difference between offense and defense, and the information was not balanced, causing it to be difficult to accurately target. The biggest problem was that there was the Great Enlightenment Temple on Clear Sky's Fangjiang Island, and it was one of the top powers in Clear Sky. Later on, it also followed the expedition army to Celestial Wolf, but they didn't establish themselves in the fifth ring, and instead went to other domains with a group of Buddhists. The reason was very complicated. Most of the Great Enlightenment Temple's forces were in the outer domain, but they focused more on clear sky than Xianyuan and the three pure ones, and this made things very difficult. Clear sky was much smaller compared to the fifth ring, and there was also the existence of the heaven and earth membrane, so it was convenient for defense, but any successful defense had to ensure that there were no internal disturbances. Since there were Buddhists vaguely targeting the fifth ring, then the Great Enlightenment Temple's attitude towards clear skies defense was very subtle. Their goal was nothing more than to eliminate Sword Vein's influence in Fifth Ring. This was also part of the Tao sects in Fifth Ring for the last 20,000 years. There was public interest, but there was also private interest mixed together. This was the reality of the cultivation world. Because of Li Wuya, the Sword Mountain Range would slowly pull him down from the altar. If they didn't do that, they wouldn't be a real Taoist or a cultivator. If the three pure ones had such a powerful figure, the Sword Mountain Range would have done the same thing. Naturally, not many people would have much respect for the Fifth Ring's hometown. They naturally believed that Wudao was from Fifth Ring, and Fifth Ring was the foundation of the world. Therefore, three pure left Blue Sky, and Tai and other Taoist sects followed closely behind. This was a concrete manifestation of this thinking. Moreover, they really didn't think it was meaningful to protect Blue Sky. They didn't think that if Blue Sky was lost, it would be harmful to the cultivation world of the main world. If it was lost, it was lost. They could just take it back. Others would think so. Even Xuanyuan's two most loyal allies of Sword Vein, Wei Sword Mountain and Firmament Sword Sect, thought so. Was it difficult to choose between saving people and losing land? Only Xianyuan didn't think so. Crow Ancestor was one of them. This was also the reason why Xianyuan didn't take any action even though Three Pure and Tai had left Blue Sky for many years. However, no matter how difficult the decision was, it had to be made. It couldn't be delayed forever, especially when the dark clouds of war were gradually beginning to show signs. To withdraw or not to withdraw, a decision had to be made. This was the reason why 6 Xuanyuan's young spirits gathered here. As the head of Xianyuan, Guan Du had a headache. He was a cultivation genius and a genius in swordsmanship. However, when it came to leading Xianyuan, he knew that he was far inferior to those peerless geniuses in Xuanyuan's most glorious era. Crow Ancestor was needless to say. Let's talk about the others. 3 Qin, Chong Lu, Wu Shixing, Hu Xuedao. They were a galaxy of talents. Any one of them was an outstanding person, but they gathered together in that era. As a result, although Xianyuan looked stronger on the surface, they lacked a real core. Before the half-immortals were summoned back, nothing could be seen. However, once the Sword Ancestors left, he couldn't bear the great danger. A small mistake would lead to a big mistake. So, should Blue Sky defend or not? If they defend, how? The discussion had been going on for too long. As the person in charge of Xianyuan, he couldn't allow such chaos to continue. He didn't want to listen to other people's opinions. If they were wrong, he would bear it alone. He couldn't be as amazing and far-sighted as the Sword Ancestors, but he could at least shoulder all the responsibilities and make it easier for his junior brothers. It was all for Xianyuan. He coughed lightly and no longer hesitated. Junior brothers! A very real problem is that I can't make an accurate judgment about the strength to defend Blue Sky. Will the enemy attack Blue Sky? How much strength will they use to attack? We don't know. The problem is, how much strength do we need to invest in Blue Sky to ensure its safety? I don't know either. Our Xianyuan sword sect has always been an elite strategy, which requires us to gather all of our forces in a battle and launch an all-out attack. Splitting our strength is a taboo in the cultivation world, especially for us. Because other than attacking, we don't know any other way. It's impossible to be like Tao sect, where a small number of people can hold back a strong enemy. Our character doesn't allow it. Habits don't allow it. Skills don't allow it. During the war, I don't want to throw my precious strength in an unpredictable direction. So I've decided to give up on blue sky. The other 5 young gods were silent. They had argued so many times that it was meaningless to argue now. They put forward their own judgments and waited for their senior brother to make a decision. No matter what it was, they would no longer oppose it. They would just carry it out. They didn't have time to argue. In fact, Guan Du's decision was also the decision of most young gods. Shizhong, Gong Yao, and Guangbo also had the same opinion. However, the youngest inner sword, Hekyu, and outer sword, Shangting, had different opinions. They had opposed it many times, but this time, they wouldn't oppose it again. According to Xuanyuan's rules, those in lower positions had the right to raise objections, but they couldn't raise more than 3 times for fear of falling into wrangling. Actually, it was not only perfected Lord Yuanying, but also those Jin Dan Foundation establishment cultivators who were willing to come, as well as those from other sects of Qin Kong who were willing to go to the 5th ring to fight. This was the last voyage. After Xianyuan, even if the Qin Kong cultivators wanted to leave, they would have nowhere else to go. There was also a group of people in the 5th ring who were in the middle of a discussion. This was the lair of Wishang. 11 young gods were sitting in a circle, and there were also some who were out on business. Just this point alone was enough to show the depth of the school of Taoism. A young god was still introducing. In addition to our Dingxin domain, we have also recruited many people from other domains. There are very few outstanding ones, but we have achieved our goal in terms of numbers. It might be a little difficult to pull them into the void universe to fight, but it is not a problem to put them in the domain to prevent the insects from attacking. Another was also very serious. We have spies in the 30 universes around the main world. The closer we are to the center, the more there will be. It is enough for us to discover them early and take the initiative to attack. It is the same in the anti-space. The coordinates have been encrypted. This was done together with the 3 Pure Ones and Xianyuan. However, I estimate that they will not approach through the anti-space, as it is easy for us to ambush them. I am afraid that they will come all the way from the main world. There were also young gods who were in charge of the internal integration of the 5th ring. The 267 sects of the 5th ring have already been organized. They are all led by masters, and they can gather in case of a battle. Everyone is familiar with this, so there will not be any mistakes. Please rest assured, senior brother. The preparation work before a war was tedious, and it was not as easy as ordinary people imagined. The people of the 5th ring had their own unique understanding of this. They were all experienced in large-scale wars, so they never doubted the success or failure of a war. The only thing they were not sure of was how they would win. A young god who had just returned put forward his own opinion. When I was traveling through the void, I once encountered a Zhuyan by chance, but I did not make any contact with it. I suddenly saw it and left. But I have always been thinking, why did the primordial sacred beasts appear in a place they should not be at such a sensitive time? Is this inevitable? Or is it a coincidence? His new discovery caused the supreme young gods to be extremely vigilant. They believed that there was a deeper level of inevitability behind every coincidence. It was just that they had not discovered it yet. The senior brother they were talking about, the current supreme elder, the young god supreme Taoist Changjin, looked at the sky. Informed the 3 Pure Ones of Xianyuan that we have one more opponent, the primordial sacred beasts. It seems that they are very dissatisfied with the restart of the era. Needless to say, these were all old monsters who had lived for thousands of years. Of course, they understood where the primordial sacred beast's dissatisfaction came from. However, this was not something they could control. A young god snorted coldly. It seems that the respect humans have received for millions of years has caused them to develop some unrealistic psychological superiority. The general trend has been set. Whether it is the side of the main world or the side of the heavens choice rebellion space, they will all follow this path. Just to vent their emotions, these so-called sacred beasts do not know what they are anymore. They should be looking for the sword vein. A young god joked. No! Our propaganda over the past 10,000 years has already put the blame on our own heads. We have achieved the goal of blurring the role of the sword immortal, but at the same time, it has also caused trouble for the fifth ring. Loss and gain have always been opposite. Another young god smiled helplessly. A young god was a little worried. Senior brother Chongjin, will mobilizing the power of Dingxin's hometown create a power vacuum and put Dingxin in danger? Chongjin shook his head. No, how many realms are there in Zhuozhou, Gemini, and Diqian? They will not take a fancy to Dingxin, because Dingxin has not caused trouble for the immortals of the immortal court. If the opponent is strong enough, they will only take a fancy to Qin Kong. A young god smiled and said, The three pure ones are still as wretched as ever. They were the first to withdraw from Qin Kong, which makes things difficult for Xian Yuan. Chongjin shook his head. No! Don't underestimate the three pure ones. If they really do something bad, they will continue to drag it out, making Xian Yuan in a dilemma and unable to make a decision. In every major event, the three pure ones are good in this aspect. It is precisely because they have to consider the overall situation that they decided to withdraw. They want to tell Xian Yuan not to have any illusions, and it is better to withdraw from Qin Kong as soon as possible. The people of the fifth ring never help each other in real danger. Family matters should be solved at home, and we can't lose face outside. On this point, the three pure ones have done it. It is also because of the three pure ones' stance that Xian Yuan has also begun to withdraw. This is a late but incomparably correct decision. A young god chuckled. Xian Yuan has no successor. If it was 10,000 years ago, how could he be so passive? Coerced by others? I'm afraid he would have withdrawn long ago. Chongjin shook his head as if he could not stop. You are wrong. If it was 10,000 years ago, they would have given up on the fifth ring. They would have protected Qin Kong. This is the style of a true sword lunatic. However, you are right about one thing. The current Xian Yuan is like a weasel. He can't be full for long and can't be swayed. This is the reason why Taoism is the true ruler of the universe. Chapter 1339. In the universe, every power that was involved in this storm was making the same preparations. In the Heaven's Choice continent, the competition between Buddhism and Taoism was coming to an end. Grouping, division, unifying. Before the army set off, there were a lot of things to do. They needed to establish a quick command system, communications, security, routes, marching arrangements, and countless other complicated things. Even if the leaders were sun gods for thousands of years, not many of them had such experience. Therefore, everything was perfected in the process of exploration, gradually changing from chaos to order. This was why they couldn't set off immediately. One person, one country, and hundreds or thousands of countries were two completely different concepts. Even mortal soldiers needed long periods of training, not to mention these unruly cultivators. The same situation was happening in Zhouxian. No matter how slow the people of Zhouxian were, they had already realized the danger they were in. In fact, the recall of cultivators had already begun, and Zhouxian wasn't lacking in people. Even the 3,000 little continents had begun mobilizing before the war. Yuanying and above had to participate in the attack and defense of the heaven and earth chessboard. None of them could stay out of it. Zhouxian had raised them, and now was the time to repay it. Recently, something big had happened in Zhouxian. The 7 upper sects of Taoism had directly pressured Bitter Zen Temple and 10,000 Buddhas to express their attitude. This was almost the final ultimatum. If it didn't mean that there would be a civil war soon. As for the final result, no one knew except for the highest level of Zhouxian, But the Buddhist machine in Zhou Xian had also been activated. Although they were Buddhists, but they were also Zhou Xian's Buddhists. Bearing the karma of those who had faded together, these things couldn't be avoided. Integration was everywhere. Under the immense pressure of the Heaven's Choice continent, the people of Zhou Xian finally united. Their war experience was extremely limited, but fortunately, they still had the Heaven and Earth chessboard. The left Zhou Galaxy, an ancient galaxy, the Azure Sky World, an ancient celestial body, Mount E, an ancient land of inheritance. Almost all the high-level cultivators of Xuanyuan's Mount Shao gathered in front of the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. This was a cultivator's intuition. Before the great change of the world, not only did they return from their travels in the universe, but also the swordsmen from the other continents in the Blue Sky continent. They had been waiting for the order from the dome for a long time. The reason why he chose to stay in the sword energy rushing to the Sky Pavilion was not because Guangbo was an external sword, but because there were very few sword cultivators in Shao Mountain. Therefore, it was unnecessary for him to go to Wingguang Peak. After reading out the orders from the dome, Uncle Guang quietly looked at the 200 nascent souls in front of him. Among them, at least half of them were elderly. After hearing his orders, they only cupped their fists in a symbolic and courteous manner. Then, he lifted his buttocks and left. It was as if he couldn't even be bothered to speak to him. Regarding this, Uncle Guang was not angry at all. Even though his cultivation was far higher than these stubborn old men, he was at a disadvantage in terms of aura. Because he wanted to retreat. But these old men wanted to resist. However, these old men did not show any signs of incitement. They were betting their lives here, but they did not want the young people to bet their lives here as well. They could understand the orders from the sect logically, but they could not accept it emotionally. It was that simple. Among the remaining dozens of Yuanying perfected cultivators, there were still people who made Uncle Guang's eyes light up. There were people he was familiar with, and there were also people he was not familiar with. When he pulled them back to the fifth ring, they were all elites that could be used. He was a little puzzled. How could there be so many good seedlings in Shao Mountain? Didn't they pull back a lot of them every once in a while? What was the reason for the omission? Personal reasons? Systematic reasons? Time is of the essence. I will not stay here any longer. The life and death battle of the fifth ring requires the participation of each and every one of you. To the sect, each and every one of you is indispensable. In the future, when you grow old, you will feel proud to have participated in this battle. There will also be people who will find new opportunities. I know how you feel about this place. What I want to say is that Qing Kong will never be lost. When the fifth ring is established, this will be the first place we will return to. You will still have the opportunity to contribute to your home planet. Then, those who are willing to follow the sect's orders, get on the raft. I, Xianyuan swordsman, do not have so many parting words. To Uncle Guang's satisfaction, very soon, there were swordsmen who responded to his call. With a start, everything was logical. This was not running away, but joining the more important battle. But gradually, his face darkened. Because the few people he valued the most did not react at all. Was this fear? Or was there another reason? He could not wait any longer. He had to end everything here as soon as possible. The resources of Shao Mountain were already packed. They were just waiting for him to go back and give the order to return. He first pointed to a swordsman he was most familiar with. She was also a famous figure in the outer Yuanying sword group, known as the Ice Fairy. But now, she was already a perfected cultivator. She was just a young perfected cultivator of 1,000 years old, and her future was bright. Smokey, what's your reason? Smokey was not afraid and looked straight at him. Good, Brother Guang knows that Smokey is a native of Qing Sky. I am a perfected cultivator here. I have the obligation to protect the mountains and rivers here. Qing Sky people? Uncle Guang was not clear about this fact, but since she insisted, This was the right given to her by the Qing's sword token. She pointed to another Kun cultivator. Although he was not familiar with him, he knew that he was the inner sword perfected cultivator who was sent to guard Qing's sky a few years ago. He also had a bright future. Yan Dai, your mission has been cancelled. Why are you so obsessed with this? Are you also a Qing sky person? Yan Dai bowed demurely, but her tone was much softer than Smokey's. But everyone present could feel the firmness in her words. Brother! The sex mission may have been cancelled, but Yan Dai never gives up halfway. Unless I am sure Qing sky is safe, I will not leave. Uncle Guang felt a headache coming on. Were all Kun cultivators nowadays so stubborn and bad-tempered? Kun cultivators could not handle it, but Qian cultivators could, right? He glared at a Yuanying who had a weaker aura. What's your name? Yuanying seemed to be cowering under the sun god's aura. Bing Bingku. Uncle Guan looked straight at him. I think you lack courage, confidence, and opportunity. Only on the battlefield can you gain courage. Only when you walk out will you have confidence. Only when you throw yourself into the great tide of the universe will the opportunity favor you. Eagles can only see further when they soar in the sky. If he only guarded his own little piece of land, he would never be able to achieve anything in the future. You lack so much, but you would still rather guard Qing sky and let down your own potential. Do you want to learn from those cowards and waste your life here? Bingku stammered. Uncle Master, I actually lack a master. Chapter 1340. Uncle Guang was somewhat exasperated. He looked at a Yuanying beside him. Why did you stay? Li Peinan said righteously. Martial uncle, because I was afraid that guy would harm others. I could only bear the responsibility. Uncle Guang felt that this trip was not going smoothly. This Shao Mountain was very strange. Not only were the old guys stubborn, but the young people were also stubborn. He stared at a slightly arrogant young man in snow-white clothes. You are at the peak of the inner sword, Yuanying. The fifth ring needs you. The smoke wave stood like a pine tree. Qing Kong also needs me. Uncle Guang sighed and looked at the last young man. He was also the youngest and had the greatest potential. You are Huang Xia? I heard the manager of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion mention you. If I can't bring a talent like you back to the fifth ring, Senior Marshal Brother Guan Du will be angry. Come to the fifth ring, we will give you a bigger stage. Huang Xia firmly shook her head. No! I want to wait here for Senior Marshal Brother. I want to see if he is lying to me. Uncle Guang understood that these people were all waiting for their Senior Marshal Brother. A person who shone brightly when he was at the Foundation Establishment realm, but disappeared after forming his core. He was also the person who the Soaring Heaven Pavilion once thought had the most potential among the Xianyuan outer swords. Unfortunately, that guy's temper was too wild. He left for 600 years. It was really hard to have so many friends waiting for him. Uncle Guang left. Cultivators were cultivators, and rules were rules. The meaning of the Azure Sword token was that cultivators could do what they thought was right. He was not an unreasonable person, and he knew that many accidents often happened in some inconceivable situations. Hopefully, it was a good result. Who knew? Looking at the floating rafts gradually rising into the sky, Ice Guest Sword felt somewhat uncertain. Marshal Uncle is leaving just like that. If he insists and accepts me as his disciple, maybe I will really go to the fifth ring. Li Peinan looked at him with some disdain. Sun God, true monarch? Do you understand? That is a great cultivator who has intuition about life and death. He dares to accept a disaster like you as his disciple? I'm afraid even a half-immortal can't resist. Only I will play with you. Who else would be willing? Ice Guest Sword did not mind. Do you guys think that senior brother will really come back? It's been more than 600 years. Maybe he's already married and had children there. No one said anything. Who could say for sure? Only the proud and aloof Yan Bo opened his mouth. Of course he will come back. because there was no commotion that he did not participate in. If you want to find a dung beetle, you have to take a dump first. Boring! Yenbo, your mouth is getting smellier and smellier. Smoky Turtle always acted like a big sister. Let's go. We'll go to Old Man Peak and discuss with the seniors how to defend against the macromembrane. Ice Guest Sword shouted from behind. Senior sister, aren't the few of us too few? Why don't Senior Marshal Brotherly and I make a trip to the Thousand Islands region and bring a few dozen rogue cultivators to Yuanying? Li Peinan said angrily. If you want to go, go by yourself. Don't drag me along. Your reputation as the jinx of Ice Guest stinks in the Thousand Islands region. I'm afraid I won't be able to come back alive. The group of people noisily flew towards Old Man's Peak. They weren't in the mood to be disappointed. Why did they stay? Each had their own reasons, but more or less, they were all related to a certain person. With their level and experience, they still didn't have a thorough understanding of the general situation. But there was one thing. A certain person had left behind this so-called jade slip more than 600 years ago. It was full of nonsense, but his grasp of the general situation still had some potential as a swindler. Since he had already guessed it, how could he not appear after the big show started? Xiaoya was mysterious. I've read in novels. Usually, this kind of return is very legendary. Do you think that Senior Marshal Brother has already transformed into the commander of the enemy, leading the enemy to jump into the pit? Smoky Turtle sighed and patted her shoulder. Xiaoya! You need to read less novels. With your Senior Marshal Brother's conduct, what else can he do besides swords? With that ridiculous little flame of his? No matter how blind the enemy is, how can they tolerate a swordsman mingling among them? And even become a commander? Huan Xiaoya was very curious. Is what Senior Marshal's sister said true? I remember that before Senior Marshal Brother left, he told me that his talent for magic cultivation was very high. Learning swords was the wrong path. Yenbo really couldn't help it. Talent for magic cultivation? Pooh! That little flame of his is more like lighting a cigarette. You can't be so fierce. Li Peinan sighed at the side. The remaining few were all strange. Needless to say, Ice Guest died that day. He would be very happy to deal with his funeral, but he might not be able to endure it. Senior Marshal's sister Smoky Turtle was born to be a big sister, ordering them around like donkeys. Senior Marshal's sister Yen Dai was mysterious, like a witch. Senior Marshal Brother Yenbo always acted as if others owed him a lot of wisdom. Everyone was stuck at the peak of Yuanying. Do you have to be so proud? And Huang Xiaoya, who looked innocent and unaffected, was actually holding back to make fun of Senior Marshal Brother. What didn't she understand? It was just that she didn't speak ill of herself and liked to hear others speak ill of her. He was very curious. When did he mix with this group of people? There was probably only one reason. A cultivator's intuition. A Dao intuition. A human intuition. Many things combined made them feel that the best choice was to stay here. From a rational point of view, this was very unreasonable. However, cultivators often didn't rely on reason in the most crucial decisions. They relied more on their feelings. They felt that there was a more important stage here. A stage that was worth a person walking on for 600 years. As for what danger there was, he never thought about it, and he believed that none of his strange companions would think about it either. My fate is in my own hands, not in the hands of the heavens. Li Peinan secretly cheered himself on. Zhou Xian Upper Realm, Carefree Continent, Great Freedom Hall Inner Hall. This was the first time Kawa entered such an important place of the sect. In Zhou Xian's 9 upper sects, each sect had a place like this. There was only one purpose: to communicate with the heaven and earth chessboard. In the future attack and defense of Immortal Zhou, the cultivators from both sides would fight to the death on the chessboard, deciding the fate of the positive and negative spaces. This would be their only battlefield, and also the reason why immortal Zhou was so confident in claiming to be the #1 realm in the universe. Now, it was time to test them. The heaven and earth chessboard's highest level of domain life and death battle had its own set of complex and complete rules. Among them, there was the autonomy of the cultivators, and there were also specialized cultivators in charge of the overall coordination. Only then could the heaven and earth chessboard's power be maximized. Kawa was proficient in chess and had a natural intuition about the rules. Her combat power was limited, so she was more suitable for this position. She was now a perfected lord, and her eyesight could keep up. She was one of the 2 dispatchers of the carefree travel. This position was not an easy one. From a certain perspective, it was extremely important. It would directly affect whether or not the most suitable person could be used to deal with the most suitable opponent. This also meant that it would affect the outcome of every battle to a certain extent. When countless battles like this were added up, the value of an excellent dispatcher would be reflected. To do this, she had to pay a lot. Not only did she have to be familiar with the rules of the heaven and earth chessboard, but she also had to be familiar with the skills and tactics of every disciple in the carefree travel. Under each upper sect, there were hundreds of small and medium-sized sects under their command. It was a huge challenge to be familiar with everyone. For her home, she was willing to devote herself wholeheartedly. The only regret was that there seemed to be one person missing from the carefree travel. If that guy was here, it would be much easier for her. No matter what opponent they were, she only needed to close the door and listen. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.